المداد يا الله اسقينا بالمداد يا الله.
الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I welcome everybody who's logged on today to the Karima live stream and to the two guests that I have that I will be introducing very shortly. And alhamdulillah, tonight is a blessed night. It's the night of Friday. It's the night of Jumu'ah. It's the night of salutation upon our Master Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in our own way, I think tonight we will be carrying out a commemoration of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who had an enormous care for the well-being of his ummah. And tonight's discussion is inshallah going to be on that, upon where the ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam stands today in our locality. And I just wanted to lay out a few clarifications before we begin, because once we announced this, we got a response from the community, and as people who are servers of the community, I thought it would just make sense to make a few points just to let people know what our intention is in terms of why we're doing this and why it's happening. And I just want to make it very clear, we're not coming here to bash people. We're not coming here to demonize people within our community. We're not here to say that certain people are doomed and damned and we need to abandon them. And this is an understanding that even though whatever people get up to, they are still our people. And they're still people who are loved by the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and by that definition we are also instructed to love them. And to understand that failings take place in any community, and it is part of that community's job to understand and have honest conversations with itself about the things that are going on, and to understand that a lot of the problems that we have in the community did not come in a vacuum. There were factors and causes and historical developments that led to the situation we're in today, and we have to be very clear that we can't depend on others to clean our house for us. And it has to be an understanding that we can't become dependent on forces outside us. I mean, just today, or just recently, there was a bombing that happened in Nashville, a suicide bombing where a white man blew up an RV van, and the media representation of him was as somebody who was suffering mental illness and he's going through whatever, and they came out in that sense, always trying to infantilize him like he's some guy who just accidentally happened to do what he did. Whereas if a Muslim sneezes in the vicinity of a non-Muslim, it's the idea that Muslim carries out biological attack or something on a British individual or something. And so we have to understand that other people are not going to come and represent us in the way that we need to be represented. And we have to understand that there have been failings in our community. And these are failings that have to be addressed and conversations that need to happen. And there will be topics today that may be of a sensitive nature, that may be slightly controversial, that people may feel slightly uncomfortable with, and that's just the nature of the conversation that's going to take place today, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So I ask everybody to listen carefully, share as much as you possibly can with people who you know have a finger on the pulse of what's happening in the community, have an interest in the well-being of their community, the people, the children, and everybody coming through. And so I'll just introduce our guests, inshallah ta'ala. Today I'm joined by Maulana Shams Tamiz, who's currently doing his PhD at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul, but is a very dear friend and a dear brother and a stalwart of the Wycombe community, somebody who's grown up in this town, gone through schooling in this town, and has a very clear understanding of a lot of the things that are happening on the ground. And who also at one point was an imam at the local masjid, and so has an insight into the toings and goings in the local community, and a very dear friend of mine and a brother and a teacher, somebody I consider a teacher and a mentor. And also we're joined by Sergeant Raja, who I have been told to emphasize very strongly is here in a personal capacity as Mr. Raja rather than Sergeant Raja. He is not a direct representative tonight of the Thames Valley Police, even though that is his job description as a sergeant within the Thames Valley Police. And he is somebody, again, I always had this idea of, I don't know if you watch too much Simpsons, you always have that, the fat police officer who just eats donuts, who the crime takes place right in front of him and he still doesn't realise. And I think Sergeant Raja destroyed that stereotype. I feel like he's an erudite man and somebody who sees deeper into a lot of the problems and things that are going on rather than just surface issue analysis. And I think that will make him a very valuable interlocutor in today's conversation, inshallah ta'ala. So I ask everybody, bring your questions, whatever points you have. I had feedback straight away from the community. I've had people message me with questions. I managed to incorporate some of them in. We've got some of them on the chat. But whatever you think, whatever you've got going on, whatever points you think that are very important that should be addressed, please, we encourage everybody to join in tonight's conversation, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And so I wanted to start off with a very controversial topic, with a very sort of maybe controversial question. But it's the idea that a lot of people had an understanding tonight that we were going to come in and it was going to be a bashing of the Azad Kashmiri community. This idea that the Azad Kashmiri community, as a representative of Muslims in the UK, has had massive failings, and there's going to be some sort of looking out from outside, looking into the Azad Kashmiri community, and this is what's wrong with you guys, and why can't you fix yourselves, and what's wrong with you, and things like that. So maybe I'll start with Sergeant Raja. I mean, is there something specific about the Azad Kashmiri community in this case that needs to be pointed out, or are we looking at a more universal problem across the board?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for having me on, firstly. I hear this often, and it's not just mentioned by yourselves, but it's such an outdated and really lazy way of looking at things to say it's a Mirpuri community or it's this community, that community. Anybody who looks at the facts and looks into any specific police areas, for example, and I'm drawing on my own experience here, can see that this is a geographic issue, socio-economic issue. This is nothing to do with where a person's from back in Pakistan. You bring some of your culture in terms of your parents, but you're in this environment. This is far from a Mirpuri problem. If anything, if there's one community I can say that actually has more of an interest in trying to do a self-resolve out of this and probably has some of the best structures to try and deal with it, ironically, is the Azad Kashmiri community. My own hometown in Reading, where this problem is prevalent, the Mirpuri community is barely involved in this kind of thing. But where there are involvements within this kind of area of drugs and things like that, most of the people involved in that are from the Punjab, or they're from Pindi, Islamabad, the Gujarat side, where my family's from. So none of that in any way proves a point about Mirpuri community at all. If anything, I think the community's own resolve to fix these things and having the Islamic side prepared to do with working with the political side to resolve these things, the will is stronger in the Mirpuri community, which I have to admire. There's no doubt about it.
Mullah Shams, would you want to come in on that, or?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah khair for having me on, Mullah. I don't have like any kind of qualitative data to give any kind of conclusive answer or any research of the sort, but it does seem to be, if we were to just look at our community though, let's not say the Mirpuri community, but the migrant community, the children and the children of migrants, perhaps we can look at it in that light. Of course, do you have indigenous white crime? Of course you do. Absolutely you have it. But if we were to just specifically look at our community and say, okay, well, within let's say the migrant community or the Muslim community, you do have problems. Could we identify a pattern as to why those problems exist within this community? And that would perhaps help us to look at solutions or possible solutions. So for example, now kids are doing a lot better at school. A lot more of our kids are going into kind of grammar schools, are doing better in the exams, etc. The nature of that is because the parents that have gone through the system once have realized that there's been a problem, on that perhaps they did not get the attention that they should have when they were at school. There was a complete miscommunication by a lot of parents and what was going on in school because of language barriers, etc. And so there's been a lot of rectification that's happened now where parents are helping their children to get a better education. So could we say that perhaps that where there was a kind of breakdown in that education, where perhaps children did not do so well, or they didn't, and so there's kind of these kind of bodies or pockets of our community where, generally speaking, those kids don't do well. Where now, even if they could do well, but there's like an atmosphere that's created, a kind of ghetto, if you like, where now it's not really that important or cool to be. You can make that money quicker, easier, etc. So I mean, we could link it as the community issue, not to say, and I don't want to disagree with Sarge because I know he's going to have a lot more information and data on this, but I'm just looking at it thinking perhaps there could be that early breakdown in education due to being a migrant community that's perhaps held, and not just any migrant community. Most of the migrants in the UK, of course, they didn't come from very educated backgrounds to begin with, so there were a lot of barriers with language and stuff when they came. So I just wonder how much of that played a part. So I'll put that back to you and see what we can come up with that.
I think one thing that's very interesting is in terms of analysing migrant communities. So I don't know if you guys saw, there was a BBC documentary, Lost Asian Boys. So they had Meherin Baig, who's like this
Oh,
Muslim woman who came in and did, oh, you know, look, all these guys, these Pakistanis, they're doing absolutely terrible. All the boys want to do is drive fast cars and deal drugs, and let's compare. And so she did a comparative analysis of different migrant communities, and she focused on like these Hindu communities, and like, oh, they're doing great. Look at them. And she went to their pub and they're drinking away, and they're like, yeah, we're doing great. And then her dad gives an analysis and goes, you know, and it's, you know, that it's become within our community also. It's become that lazy analysis that it's like, oh, the reason we've got this drug problem in our community is because the guys are greedy and the parents don't care, and it's just the most lazy analysis that anybody can possibly give. And it's like, okay, now we need to dig a lot deeper within this issue to have an understanding of the factors that have given birth to the phenomenon that we see in front of us today. And it's going to have to be an indigenous analysis. I really feel this, that we have to recognize these problems within ourselves. And so I really want to start off there. I mean, in terms of, for example, Sergeant and I were already in conversation about doing this live, and then recently we had an incident locally where a window was broken in Castlefield. Whoever knows what happened, maybe you guys know, and we don't want to touch on it too much because of the sensitivity around it. But what are some of the institutional, foundational problems that have now led or are causes for the gang, the drug problem specifically that we have within our communities, and then maybe off the back of that we can go back and forth and probe some of them a little further.
but I mean, you're right to mention not to discuss that case. It's an ongoing case, and as the investigation's going, I wouldn't be proper for us to mention anything in there. Obviously, something that can compromise. But if anyone has any information, as ever, you can approach the local police area and inform them. Some of the drivers for this kind of thing touch on multiple areas, and I'm glad you mentioned that program actually, because that program was deliberately actually made in a different way and sold in a different way. But the presenter herself was never really part of the actual community, wasn't really part of the Pakistani community to begin with. And let's face it, the areas she went to were absolutely dead. She deliberately went to areas that were going to raise eyebrows in terms of the attitudes, no different to finding any Patels in that area from India. And the fact that she did that was quite dubious. She had a social media backlash for it from the Asian community in general, in fact, even from Indians that were testifying that's not correct. The English community, however, that were under the preconception of backward Muslims, they absolutely loved her for it and embraced her. And that gives, there's always a career interest in funding for these kind of programs, which, is a program podcast in itself. I think the problem comes in that our community, we're the best in terms of the initiative. I still genuinely believe that the spirit of a Pakistani to be able to go into something and drive our will, our objectivity, and our hard work, it's second to none. We've made a success, regardless of the topic of the program today. We are a success in this country in many ways, but that also comes with consequences. There's areas of our community which haven't kept up with the success. We have very affluent Pakistanis, incredibly affluent Pakistanis. We have some of the best businessmen as well, all Pakistanis. At the same time, we have areas that aren't so affluent. They haven't been brought along in the same way. We miss the fact that we aren't as sociological as Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad puts it. We've lost some of that ability to look inward to make sure we're moving in a religious way, in an ethical way. But the main reason is we came here for economic reasons. I think if you consider, for example, the issue of grooming, if you look at the things with drugs, the drivers for many of these things are the same thing. It's money, it's a quick buck, but at the same time, I've had conversations with friends and colleagues at work and other people work in this field, not necessarily in the police, but partner agencies. And we often ponder this equation. No parent raises their child to be a criminal. No parent raises their child to be a drug dealer, regardless of whether the parent themselves is ever involved in drugs themselves. They aspire better. They don't go to school to become drug dealers. No teacher teaches them to be one. They go to masjids after school. No imam trains them to be one. No one wants them to be a drug dealer. Yet somewhere along the lines, there is a narrative that's far more powerful than the one that a parent, a teacher, an imam can give, that at some stage it pierces through that young person. And it's very, very easy for us to say this young person is a drug dealer. We should all absolutely go to town on them. We should shop them all out. And I guess my day job is to come down hard on them. And I do often. But we have to look beyond that now. There are causes that we're missing here. There are things that these lads are so young that are getting involved now. In my day, when I was many, many years ago, when I was a young teenager, all the drug dealers were older men. They drove around flash cars. Everyone knew who they were, but they were few and far between. The drug dealers today are very, very young kids. And some of that is actually down to the fault of the governmental drug policy. And I will say, regardless of any consequence that comes on me, the fact is that when we criminalize, when we have a justice system which is a little bit lenient on young people for the right reasons, there are people out there from county drug lines that will take advantage of it. If you get an adult drug dealer who goes down for something, a young lad will get away with quite a bit before they're finally going through the criminalization process. That has a direct consequence on the availability of drugs in a direct area where before you had one person supplying, you've got multiple people supplying. It's far more easily available. The people pushing this poison into our communities, the first thing they poison is our young people in their minds. They are poisoning and getting through to our young people in a way that they've never, in the history of mankind, people have never been able to appeal to young people in this way. Your phones at home are connecting absolute strangers to your children in powerful ways that you couldn't even imagine.
So
sorry.
Can I just say, if you don't mind, just to go back a little bit on the point that Saj mentioned, which is very important about, there's only so much that a parent, teacher, imam, etc. can do, because like the atmosphere that's around a lot of our young people, for sure, is so impactful onto their lives that the question is like, how much can you actually do for them now when their friends, their social circle, the kind of the older guys, the gangs, etc., that it's so appealing, or there's so much pressure on them, or whatever it may be, and you're talking about phones, etc. But I mean, so just to stop there for a second, and just before we go off into drugs more specifically, perhaps it's that, well, is it really that easy to just say there's not a lot that a parent can do, there's not a lot that a teacher can do, there's not a lot that an imam could do? Because you mentioned all of those things, and I just started to go back through memory lane of my own life, and I don't know, like most people that are probably listening to this, we've got lots of people listening to this. Most of us were kicking around on the streets, until took us in a different path. But so when you start thinking, you think actually, but if you, and perhaps each one of these points could be a podcast in and of itself, but if you are in a schooling system that isn't always able to, I mean, if you've got 30, 35 students in a class, it's not always easy to engage with every single student, etc. So we got to look at the capacity of the schools, the style of education, that's a whole separate area. Then you're thinking about mentorship. I mean, if you're thinking about imams, for example, then are those imams equipped to be able to deal with young people? Are they given training? I mean, the fact that you can have an imam that comes into a community, forget the language issue. That's a separate issue altogether, whether they can speak the language. But can you imagine that everyone's a professional here, let's say, that's listening. I mean, it's very rare that you go into a professional job and you're not given training. It's very rare that there's not ongoing training to help you as and when it is needed. So the idea that you can have an imam and he's there for 50 years, 60 years even sometimes, or 35 years, whatever, and there's no training that's added on There's no building of those imams. And the idea that you need to build those imams to be able to do that. So if there was, when those children were going to the masjid, I mean, now the generations are, it's different. People are not going to the masjid so often. The kids, they're going to academies that are designed specifically for this. But when they were going to that, the imam, he had an important place. He could have instilled at least an idea. He can't change anybody, but he could have instilled an idea. He could have taken that seriously. But if they were unaware of that, they didn't even realize that these were problems. So I'm just saying, yani, there could have been more done in that regard. Also in terms of parents. I mean, I was having a conversation with a parent whose kid was on Snapchat as I was speaking, and the kid had previously got into a lot of trouble through Snapchat, violence, lots of issues, and the mode of communication was Snapchat. So I asked a very simple question: that why does he still have Snapchat? Like what like I don't understand. If the means has become Snapchat, why have you not taken a stronger means? I could see a comment here about Iftiali about, yeah, I agree, it's not about coming down hard. But as a parent, whilst that child is still in your care, there has to be an element of assertiveness that is displayed before that child, where they realize that they can't get away with everything. So not to oversimplify all of this stuff, and just to wrap up on that point, that I get the point that there's society is quite, it's yani, it's, but you have to take extreme measures in extreme circumstances. So I know of people, for example, that have moved. If their son has got into a gang, into a lot of problem, they've moved to a different city or to a town just to remove them from that situation for a while, just to cool off the air. People have taken extreme measures to do the best that they can. So I just think the idea that there's nothing that parents and teachers, I think it's too cheap. I think that we're living in extreme times, and so there needs to be a kind of extreme measures put in place to make sure that we can safeguard these children. I just wanted to put that in there just before we move on, and perhaps just finally, before Monla, you jump in there, we can push a little bit further on the idea, because I don't think that we can just say that there's nothing to do with us as a community, that it's gonna be any. I can't believe that there's nothing to do with us as a community that is not a factor playing in to why the situation is the way it is. I don't think it's as clear as just saying, oh no, we're all in this together. I think there has to be some things within that community, specific to that community, that have led to certain things, or factors at least, to led to these sorts of things that we see as well. So I wouldn't, yeah, I'd like to like probe that a little bit more if we could.
I think one of the very important points that we have to recognize is the type of people that will be tuning in right now are people who have at least a connection to the deen, and an understanding of and a concern in Islamic terms for the community that they live in. And so the conversation we need to have within ourselves is the idea that how have we failed as representatives of religious institutions, to an extent, to put forward alternatives and deterrents that wouldn't allow people to go down the different pathways? I mean, I know, Saj, you mentioned the idea of we need to, I don't know, you indicated towards, you weren't very, you didn't say explicitly, but the idea that we need to be more punitive. And I think that's one of the more dangerous routes to take, when you start being more punitive and start cracking down harder and I'll give you, you're going to get, obviously, I'll give you a chance to get back on this, but being more punitive, it causes more problems. There's more repercussions. Children are taken out of home environments, placed into more dangerous environments where criminalization can more easily happen. There's a labeling that takes place. There's a lot of these ideas that I think are very problematic. Now, there's a few points that I'd love to delve slightly deeper on, and then you can come back on the punitive points as well. Is, I think, the idea of the intention, the niyyah, the why we're here. And there was a very clear idea that when our forefathers came, they had an idea of returning back. This is why all the courties are built back home that nobody's going to visit. They had this idea that we're going to build and we're going to invest and we're going to come back home. Jay?
The myth of return, as the artist calls it.
Yeah, the myth of return. Like, we're going to go back, and by the time the next generation came along, they're like, nah, we don't actually want to go back. We like electricity that works all the time, and Wi-Fi, and all of these other things, and we're very happy where we are. And then now they weren't ready to deal with what was the repercussions of that, and so the institutions weren't in place. And I think that's going to be a very important discussion we need to have. Also, Saj, you mentioned the idea of the masajid. I think Maulana Shams is very right. There are constant points within a person's day where influences can be made, and there are very many pathways that people can take towards criminality. The idea that you sort of I think the masjids have to take a lot, especially within the Azad Kashmiri community. I think they have to. There is no denying this. There are, but with all due respect, the masajid which are functioning, some of the best masajid in this country, are in communities, maybe in Salafi communities, where they're now they had an understanding of the institutions that needed to be in place, whereas we were neglecting a lot of factors. And I think we can probe the masjid factors specifically. What are the problems? What were the problems within the masajid that we grew up attending, and what were the successes within some of the masajid we grew up attending? So I'd love to delve slightly deeper on the idea of the intention and the reasons people came here, and what were the repercussions of those intentions, and very maybe probe further on the failings of the masajid and what solutions. I think this is the most important thing tonight. Solutions. That what solutions can we possibly put forward for the Islamic institutions to now catch up? We're 20 years behind, but we still can do something. We're not, al-Muslimu la ya'rifu al-ya's, as Sheikh Tantawi used to say. The Muslim does not recognize despair. This is not in our dictionary. So we have to have an idea of positive steps that we can still take. But I'll let you come back, Sarge, on the idea that everybody thinks that you just want to beat up every 16-year-old in the UK.
I mean, the offer's there. I can't deny it. I mean, look, I just to clarify, I'm not actually for punitive measures specifically on a topic like this, because the problem, for me, the problem is it's a philosophical one, it's an ethical one. It's there's something at the root of an individual that takes place which really fascinates me, and that fascination is there for both an ethical reason and a personal reason. I'm Pakistani. I have sons. I have daughters that are growing up in these communities. I have a vested interest, just like any of you guys have. And at the same time, I'm on the other end of the spectrum, where I get to see aspects of our community that your average Mr. Khan wouldn't see. And with respect to that side of things, I also get to see the misery that this stuff creates. I get to see the zillat that happens on the family when searches happen in the houses as a subsequent consequence of an arrest for drugs. I see the faces of our women when police officers enter in a way, big burly officers with weapons walking into a house, no matter how respectfully and with absolute respect and lawful entry, they will come in and say, I am going to intrude into your house and look for these drugs. I see the consequences of all these things. Now, for me, the question for us as a Muslim community is that if we identify ourselves as Pakistanis, that's fine. But I think it's important for us to also look at this as a Muslim community. This isn't just Pakistani centric. And at the same time, being Muslim means that we have an ethical grounding to the actions of our community. And I don't necessarily see it as a failure that our community happens to have these problems. I think it's a challenge that we have. And you're right to see it as something that needs solutions. Now, where it comes down in terms of these individuals and the way they work, just to give you a bit of background, there's aspects to how they work, how they do things that people misconstrue very, 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 very quickly. There are young people who are forced into drugs. There are young people who are forced to sell drugs. There are young people that get involved through peer pressure. Imam Haddad, Rahimullah, once said, the biggest influence on your children, the baddest influence on your children is other children. So it doesn't matter how good parents, masajids and schools can be. And what fascinates me isn't just the narrative that pierces the individual to go into this life. There was something I read by Imam Birgawi Rahimullah, who once said that the action of an individual, I'm going to quote him, I do love him. He said that good morals breed good actions. Good actions, before that, you have to develop good character. And the converse, the opposite of it's absolutely true. Having bad morals brings in something to do with a bad character. Now, that bad character, that specific place is where I'm fascinated with, because all the actions that come afterwards are the consequence. Within that, there is what we call a roadman culture, where it's very interesting if you listen to some of the raps that these young persons are coming out with. And I don't judge them. I don't denigrate why they do it, but I have my own thoughts on why they do it. Most of it's all around a kind of grief mentality, of victim kind of centrality. There's a mention in there of retribution. There's a lot of nafsi, egoistic kind of characterization of an individual to try and reclaim some sense of loss in some way. And you'll be surprised because they're probably growing up in absolutely decent surroundings. They're eating absolutely fine. They're not living in a specific ghetto like people in America or inner city London are. But at the same time, these things, why are they there? Now, there is a process that this specific culture will undertake an individual to go through. It otherizes other people. It massively enforces an individual to come to terms with the life they're about to get into. And to do that, this is the specific most fascinating point that I think we need to look at, that in order to do this criminality, there is a breakdown of a conscience that has to take place, or at least a subjugation of it. So the other person, you have to automatically assume they've done some wrong. You have to assume that there is a greater good that you're about to do, regardless of the consequence that you're going to put others through. This takes place in most types of criminality that our community at the moment is being purported to be involved in. So when these young people are getting involved in that kind of thought process, that is where I see that we can, not just as a community, but work with our partners to try and specifically target that mentality. Because if we grow that sense of, if we ignore this growing sense of sort of like a victim culture in the mind of the young person, that they feel they have to super compensate some form of a misplaced masculinity, and to not recognize the pain that they cause to others or the consequences that return back on their own families, the risk they put them into. I think once we miss that, we've completely missed the trick on how to get right in there into the mentality of this young person. You got to remember, a lot of these young people are in various rebellious stages of their life. They're at a stubborn stage where they don't feel that they're understood. And this isn't something that's now, this is just a story of man. It was something I read from Aristotle, who once said that, young people at this day and age, they feel they're not being listened to. They're burning things down and rioting. They're not listening to the damage that they do to the victims that they oppress. And so this has gone on for centuries. This is nothing new. But I
Right.
think as a community, if there's a place for us, that's the place to really target those individuals and get that good character back, and completely oppose the bad character traits that we can start seeing from them.
I just want to say on that before I bring it to Mullah Shams, because I think we need to backtrack it slightly. I think this idea of the cultivation of bad character that Sergeant Sarge is talking about is very important, but there's this very clear idea that you have one of the big things in criminology is this idea of informal social control. Your community and the people around you, and the sort of triggers around you and the incentives that are placed around you have a massive influence on the production of the individual, right? And here's where we need to sort of backtrack again. Where have we failed in terms of proving or providing that informal social control, that people do feel that there are communities in which they belong, where they don't feel like they need to turn to certain, or the development of dysfunction? Where is this happening? And I think back once again, just to probe that question again about the masajid. So just turn it back to the masajid before we go further. I mean, some people might even say the idea of the rap music is a reflection of the poverty that you see in inner city London, which is a very, those are communities that are really struggling, and a lot of that is sort of, I don't want to, you don't justify, but there's an understandability that you can have of the reason why people go down certain paths for that community, and it doesn't really reflect as well for our community that we look to that specific symptom of a deeper cause and just latch onto that and say, oh, we need to be like them, even though they have so many causes that are causing them to come to that. But Mullah Shams, if I can just come back to you on the idea of the question we had before on the intention and the masjid failings.
It's a hard statement to say masjid failings. So I'm gonna retweak it a little bit and just say where the masjid, of course, could have done more. I think that's probably more sounds nicer. Because obviously it's not been a complete, alhamdulillah, there has been a lot of khair that's come from the fact that the masjid is there, you know. Because if our community couldn't build a masjid, we wouldn't give the money for it. So alhamdulillah, the masajid are there, and our elders built these masajid all over the country for us. However, I remember when Habib Kazim came, and the Hadrami Habaib are they're masters of da'wah, and they understand usually where the problems lay. And when he came to England, he started to talk a lot about futuwa and rujula, the idea of futuwa of how would you translate that, Mullah? Chivalry.
Ma- masculine chivalry.
Yeah, yeah. I
but
mean,
not necessarily specific to men, because
men.
you have in the Quran, Sayyidah Maryam is referred to as min al-qanitin, the
No,
masculine,
no,
even though she was a woman.
no. And the rijalul haditha, of course, many of them are muhaddithat, they're female. So the word rajula, even though the word rajul, because they, yani, because anyway, so that's a different philological discussion. But the point is that when he said that, one of the things that he guided them to was to introduce sunnah sports in order to channel that, you could say, that desire for people to do something physical, for them to engage physically, to do something to help them. So I remember them, obviously Felicity House they employed, and this trickled all through the country. Karima runs, Brazilian jiu-jitsu classes with, mashallah, specialists who are Muslim, and they are, jiu-jitsu masters. And see, now you may be thinking, well, what's this got to do with anything? I think it has a lot to do with it, because when I'm thinking about Sahaba that were leading armies at the age of 17, when I'm thinking about small teenage children that were getting their way onto the battlefield despite not being allowed and wanting to engage, you're thinking to yourself, well, like, look at the youth, like the youth of the Sahaba, what were they doing, and where have we been? So then you got to ask, well, what was happening? Because there, every day after Fajr, they were practicing archery. Every day that they were practicing how to ride horses. Every day they were practicing how to fight with swords. Every day they were. So what I think, if we're talking specifically about young men and not young girls here, for example, is you can say that, I mean, without trying to talk about kind of this bogus toxic masculinity, because it seems like every time you talk about masculinity, it has to be toxic masculinity. Like there's no other way that you can be talking about it. But to be frank, if we're talking about young men growing up and that they are young men and they need to feel like young men, if they don't have enough, as Mullah was mentioning today and previously as well, alternative methods to be able to express that masculinity. Of course, poverty is there, education is there, etc., etc. Those are all individual factors. I'm not denying anything. By the way, I mean, there's lots of comments and people are talking, but just asserting one thing does not negate the other things. Like they're not mutually exclusive. We're just talking about this one thing specifically. So I think as a masjid, or as a community, we perhaps these are where there could have been more work, where you could have recognized how these children are growing up and what they would need, so that they would not feel to the need to go around in the community as part of a gang and to show how strong they are, to get violent, to stab people, shoot people, or sell drugs, or build a name for themselves, because that is all a way of boosting their egos. It's a way of, it's a way of bloating their inner desire to be respected, to be honored, etc., etc., etc. So there could have been other ways where we could have guided that to allow them to feel like that, but in a way that's positive and beneficial, as opposed to a way which is actually toxic and negative. So yeah, that's what I would say on that. I don't think there was enough. Just as a last point, I don't think that there was enough, as you mentioned earlier as well. There wasn't a niyyah when we came. There wasn't a clear, this is the path. Let's study it. Of course, they were busy. They were poor. They had to fend for their families back home. I'm never going to judge them for those sorts of things, because I don't know what it feels like to have gone through that level of poverty. So, and again, thanks to our elders. But I'm just saying that on that point here, it's important that for whatever reason, there wasn't a clear idea of how do you raise these young boys, for example, how do you raise them to be young men, where it isn't going to be toxic and oppressive, but at the same time, it isn't going to be so failed that they can only express that masculinity through gang violence, and making a name for themselves on the streets. That method, I think, was overlooked, because again, we weren't trained. We didn't understand that that's what we were supposed to be doing. We just thought that society, because if you came, let's say you came from Pakistan, well, not to say that it's perfect or that whatever, but generally society took care of most of these sorts of things, generally speaking. In a good society, that would have happened. Whereas now, when you've come here, it's a complete cultural shift, and you had to have done it all yourself, but you didn't realize that, and then you lost a couple of generations in the process.
I think
Okay,
looking
sorry.
at the generation now, for where we are now, I mean, we certainly don't have a problem with um, masculinity being an issue in our community was still very patriarchal, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that. It's part of our culture. When done right, it works, and there's other aspects that we could discuss on it. But I genuinely, as much as I feel for the young lads that get involved in this kind of thing and kind of get drawn into it, let's make no bones about it. Most of these boys that do get involved in this kind of thing, their parents are aware of what they're up to. Now, whether they don't feel that they can speak to someone about it, or whether they don't feel strong enough to be able to challenge that behavior inside the house, whether the beast that they couldn't create or work with at the time has become too big for them to manage, I think we shouldn't forget that actually those parents that came in for those economic reasons that took a back seat thinking that we're raising kids, of course they're going to be raised to be moral and not be oppressive to other people in the local society. Whereas in Pakistan, they probably would have. They had the whole village raising the son, for example, and the daughter. But now that doesn't take place. Now there's other people willing to raise your children from peer groups that have massively taken over. And when you add to that a financial edge to make easy money, and there is a route for having relevance and a rank within a peer pressured group, that you're literally given a nickname to boost your ego. You're given finances to be able to make very, very quick, easy money to fund your lifestyle. To me, how a parent couldn't understand where is this extra money coming from? Where's little so and so suddenly wearing £300-400 trainers, rolling around in very expensive cars? There is no way anyone can ever say to me with a straight face that these families are not aware where the funding for all of this is coming from, and quite frankly, some of them have been not just negligent in it, and they've massively profited from it. This is where I think the community serious conversation needs to take place. Do I advocate a punitive approach? Not really. The police is doing a job in that already. What I advocate within the community process is that we need to actually stop lauding this whole kind of material prominence that we absolutely feel like, mashallah, what a great extension you've had, like, mashallah, what a fantastic car you've got. Instead of turning around and saying, do you know what, mashallah, by your son or daughter is 15-20 years old, I've never heard a bad thing about your child in terms of getting involved in crime. Everyone's kids make mistakes. I've made mistakes. I've rarely met anybody in life who hasn't made mistakes. But as a community, we need to normalize challenging things that don't look right to us instead of just gossiping. And the problem that we're starting to now see is that that one niche group that is influencing the rest and almost advertising that lifestyle to recruit young people into it, there's a complete lack of challenge to them. No one's challenging any of it. And if a group of police officers were to come up to them, and we have to be honest about this, if police officers come up and start challenging them in the local community, we have one half of the community that's saying, absolutely go for it. We want nothing to do with this. This is wrong, and we want you to challenge them. And we'll have other sections of the community who'll be like, right, the police is going too far. Now, this is not a conversation for today. This is probably some other time. But I think that's where a conversation also needs to take place. The parents they may not have had much to do with their road into criminality, but they're certainly not the ones that are directly involved. They're certainly not taking a strong enough role of dealing with it. And maybe we as a community aren't helping facilitate the support for them either.
Can I just come back on that? I get the idea of like societal shifts and this idea that we need to change the mindset. And I think if we start thinking, I'm more of a micro guy. I think if you start aiming for gigantic societal shifts, because we have to understand this is not just a Muslim, like this, the materialistic mindset is a universal problem that humanity has faced since its inception. And so now for us to say this is now going to be our calling will be very difficult. It's a more or less an impossible task. The Prophet ﷺ said that near the end of times, one of the things that will become a hallmark of the believers will be hubbud dunya wa karahiyatul maut, that they will love the dunya and they will hate death. And there's an idea that will cause us to become very hollow believers, and there's no denying that is a process that is going to take place. I don't see us being able to shift that. What I do see is this idea that I think one of the most important things you did mention there, Sarge, is this idea of the village, what the village used to do once upon a time. I mean, I remember I was reading Pinker, and he was like, even in situations where the father is absent, if there's somebody who can step into the father's shoes, the child can still be cultivated. This not just because a child grows up in a single parent household doesn't mean he's doomed to damnation. We have many cases within Islamic history of great imams who were born in single parent households whose mothers brought them up because there was an idea that there were institutions in place, the masajid, the guild, the futuwa guild, the awqaf, the trusts, the charities. There were things in place to make sure this child would have spiritual cultivation that would take place from birth till his inevitable death. Now, the point, and I love what Mullah Sham said, the idea of the sunnah sports, and I get that, but I think to say that the masjid should offer sunnah sport is to say that they've sort of offered everything else, and now they just need to go up to the bonus level, and now we need to think about sunnah sports. I personally believe, and you guys can criticize me on this, that there have been base failings in the masjid as an institution, and maybe failings, I don't know, that could have done more. We could be euphemistic in the language, and I understand that we have to be very careful. This is our community, but there has to be an understanding that I get the idea that the imam comes over from Pakistan and he doesn't get it, and the masjid, our migrants set up the masjid committee and they don't really get it, and there's a process of acclimatization and analysis that takes place. But I guarantee you there was a point where people realized that things were going wrong and a dysfunction was setting in, and at that point we didn't act. And the masajid had moments to reform and rectify, and they didn't. Now that's my concern. That's what I'm really concerned about. That it's not the idea that we can offer all the bonuses, but what can we offer on the baseline as a community to fill in, to be surrogates in the positions where the community once used to be the father of the child and would help in his upbringing and spiritual nourishment.
Fidya, it's interesting because you're talking about at what point was there this realization. I mean, back in the 1980s, you had someone like Sheikh Pirzada, who sits there after being an imam for 8 years, in Wycombe, by the way, and says, and as he always likes to quote, he would say that, I just realized to myself, कि मैं इस society के लिए misfit हूँ. These were his words. And I've heard him say it so much so I can say it a quote. And he goes, I feel like I'm a misfit for this society. So I'm going to do something else where I'm going to produce British scholars and then they can give da'wah to people. And so then he left and he sets up his Institute Jama Karam. The point from that, like the shahid here, is what? Is that was a realization that was being had as early as that period. I mean, he's very early, right? So I don't think that's not. But I think there's a deeper question here. I don't want to go into it. It's one of those sorts of questions where you've got to look at intentions on the part of everybody, on the part of the individual as well, not just the institution. For example, even if I don't want to get into this sort of thing because I can never talk about people's intentions. I can't know things, but you've got to ask yourself a question. Like, look at the intention of Sheikh Pirzada, that he gives up a job because he realizes that he can't do something, and he was jobless for a while. By the way, he was jobless for a while, but he said that I couldn't come to terms with the fact that I was in a position that I was unable to actually do, even though he probably could have done a lot, no doubt. But my point is that there's a lot of these sorts of questions that have to be asked about people in positions that shouldn't be in positions. But people won't leave positions because of, again, economic reasons, so to speak. So, and also, just to go back onto that, I'm not talking about just Sunnah sports. I was given an example that was an example of where we could have thought out of the box to help masculinity in children, meaning channel that masculinity so it doesn't become toxic or etc. However, I think even the idea of just creating an environment in the masjid where those children that grew up, I mean, let's just be honest about it. Most Asians, it's like a joke. Like, we could do a stand-up comedy show for hours just talking about the sort of stories that we have from our mosque days. Let's just be honest. Like, and then PC Sergeant's gonna have to come in and arrest everybody, right? Because it was.
Well, I've suffered as well, brother. I've gone through those lovely cultivative teachings.
That's why he's a police officer. He's still dealing with that trauma.
That's why I've got to stick against the rest of society now.
Hey, just to hang on to that word that you used about trauma. Now, I'm saying that when you're talking about the masjid, if every time you walk into the masjid you feel irked because of the psychological associations that you have attached with being beaten up in the masjid, physically abused, spiritually abused, in certain cases perhaps even sexually abused, and most definitely you were abused through word, like, for sure. So if your self-esteem was killed in the masjid, then that's never going to be an avenue for you to now be built up. That's where you were supposed to be built up as an individual, but instead the opposite was happening. So I mean, just take it, because I mean, if you take a masjid in a community where a lot of the drugs and stuff is happening, you got to ask a question that all of those children at one point spent a number of years in that masjid. Was there nothing that could have been said to them? Nothing that could have been done at that point? Or what? Or was it just these children are coming and they're treated almost like enemies? Sometimes it can be.
Or
Ustaz,
were
there's
there
one really good
efforts
point.
done that were curtailed because people didn't see it in their interest for these things to carry on?
But there's another thing to this as well. Both those institutions that we just mentioned, both the masjids and the parents, there's one word we're missing that is one of the most toxic things once it enters an individual, that no matter what comes in, it grows and it affects the individual's ability to succumb to the values of those institutions. And that's resentment. Once we I don't think we recognize how corrosive resentment can be in a young person towards any institution that they feel either let down with, or they have like an inner I don't even know the kind of word we can translate it into in our language, but resentment is probably one of those powerful things that could turn an individual absolutely against and rebel against an institution to a massive extent that they won't see that's the damage that they'll be causing themselves.
Nafrat is good.
It's coming to a point now where once that resentment starts to enter an individual's mindset, they will not care what damage they're going to do to forget society. They're not going to care what damage they do to themselves. And resentment comes from an inner anger and the inability to express that anger in a way that they can come to terms and rationalize that issue. And I absolutely agree. There's times I go past if I go past the masjid I grew up in, I still do, joking aside, I do still shudder. There's a memory that you do have of that place.
You know, there's a comment that somebody has put up that we have no good live role models in the community. I don't think that's true. With all due respect, with a lot of love and respect, I think there's plenty of people that you have good role models in, people that have done very, very well, spiritually as well as materially. And I don't mean just I'm talking about just good. We have lots of good role models. In fact, I think I can speak for Mullah Asim when I said that many of us, if it wasn't for those role models, we probably wouldn't have come, to Islam in that sense, in that way, So I mean, I don't think that's true. I think we have a lot of khair. I think we have a lot of those good role models. But I just think, as Saj was saying earlier, I just think that overall power of that culture at that time, it's so powerful. And then you've got all of these where you could have done better in these so crucial. I was in a masjid one, and this is not in Wycombe, by the way. I visited a masjid, and I have to make clear that it's not in Wycombe. But I visited a masjid, and I just sat in a class. I was visiting, and I was talking to this kid who had been in the masjid for 8 years, and I was like, and you haven't finished the Quran? He said, no, you haven't finished the Quran. I was like, how come you haven't finished the Quran in 8 years? And his reading was good too. And he goes, every time my teacher gets angry with me, he puts me back as a punishment. And I thought to myself, how much is he gonna hate the Quran? Astaghfirullah, may that never be the case. How much is he gonna hate the Quran where it was a punishment for him? Like that was a punishment for him. The Quran became a punishment for him. And I thought to myself, this is the thing. That mentality was very problematic for a lot of people. They didn't have that. So this is, we're picking on the mosque right now and in specific, but that's good because it's an issue, certainly. Also with parents, are we looking at the comments? Some of them, come on guys, there's no need to, there's a lot of comments that are just for folly and joy, but some of the comments are really interesting. One of the comments on there was about, a lot of the comments were about parents. So let me put a question to Saj, that the people that you're dealing with, these young people, or let's say when you were at Cripps school, you're dealing with these kids, like how much of a role do you feel that it plays on the part of the parents? Are the parents, do they have their hands tied behind their back? Of course they've got to go to work, they're busy, but is that a good enough excuse? Their mums, okay, they don't speak English, let's say in that generation, they didn't speak English. Is that a good enough excuse? Do you think that my dad was so busy, Allah bless him, he worked 16-hour shifts, which they did, and my mum, she was just trying to raise 5 of us, 6 of us? Are these good enough excuses for why there wasn't a lot of attention paid to homework for a lot of kids, or what they're doing, where they're going, with whom they're hanging out, etc.?
And can I just say something on the back of that, just to add on there, that's a first generation parenting problem. But the thing is, the cultivation of these individuals is still happening within our community, though the
In fact,
parents have
closed
now
down.
gone through. They've gone through the education system themselves. Now we assume the parents have an understanding of the way the system works, but still we're having people who are taking a different path. And I think, yeah, Saj, you can come on in on that now.
So just to answer your question, there's a big difference. And just this, I'll give you an analogy. I'll give you an allegorical example where we had one parent who didn't even, she couldn't read, bless her, and she seemed very attentive to her children. She says, I look at their reports. I can't read it, but I look at their reports. And bless her, she just did not understand where she was going wrong, what she could do. She gets someone to try and read it. And she was very, very busy. She lived in a house with lots of kids, supporting the rest of the family. So what we did at the time with some of the pastoral support was that we said that if you have a teacher's report that's written in red, that's like a traffic light. Just come in. We need to talk to you. If it's written in, normal ink, then just consider everything is going fine. And we did little things like that. Today's generation, I'll be really honest, I don't think we can even see such example. This is going back 15 years ago. We are still seeing very similar behavioral issues. Behavioral issues are quite a common one. That to me has always stood out as a strong character. That person's either going to have a strong enough conviction to stay righteous, or they're going to potentially be stubborn enough to resist any work that anybody else puts in and go completely wrong way. And both these individuals had hardly any difference between them at school. There's to kind of touch a little bit on what those parents could have done. I genuinely don't think when you send your kids into school and they spend most of their times at school. I mean, this year is an exception, obviously, because of COVID. But when you send your kids into a school environment on a regular basis with the varied curriculums that they have, I think there's an onus that the parents naturally expect the school to be taking in terms of the pastoral sort of understanding of their children, almost ethically. The parents, like, I send my child to a masjid. Why aren't they learning, what not to do and what to do? There's a lot of assumptions that are made that are still prevalent despite the parents having gone through those systems. And the assumptions are very easy and lazy assumptions for individuals to make because, let's face it, everyone's busy. Before I remember in my day, my dad was the only one that was working. He could support the house and his relatives back in Pakistan and whatnot. And now in our generation, even our wives are working, and it's a very different time. Financially, families are struggling, and the area High Wycombe and Southeast is a very competitive area to live in anyway. I think that the thing comes in where I've noticed is where parents take a greater interest in the child's education, you don't tend to see these problems as such. And that's because they've mapped out an entire kind of long-term plan for those children from the word go. That child will not set one foot wrong in terms of missing their tuition, in terms of the targets that they will set for their children. And these parents, and I call them professional parents, not necessarily because they're in professional jobs, but they are parents who've made a commitment. They have clearly gone out and done the research into how to develop their children to, for want of a better term, move up an economic class in a way, but more importantly, move out of their environment into somewhere better. Those parents will work double those shifts, forget the relatives back home. They will work for those children. And I've met parents like that from that time up to this time. I've
Can I
hardly seen these problems with them.
can I just say something on that? Because I feel like one of the things that happens with helicopter parenting, I mean, there's a very good book, Jonathan Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind, is you have children who are not used to sort of, how would you say, unorthodox, rough environments, even to the slightest degree. And then you have a lot of children who are then very sensitive, who grow up in a lot of safe spaces, and there's a lot of problems associated with that. But I just wanted to come back in on something. One of the comments that I really liked is Iblal, brother Iblal, that we all know very well, who says that we're dissecting an issue that has occurred. The difficult part is how to pull your community with you. Now, part of what you said there, Sarge, is this idea that people, if you now give your children an economic goal that you now have to reach the next class. You're lower middle class, you have to reach the middle class. You're in the working class, you have to reach. And we have had people do that. Who, for example, I'm from Castlefield. You have people who do well, and what do? They leave Castlefield and they move out, and that's now seen as a
Yeah.
success story. That for me is not a success story. A success story is that I've achieved and I've done well. Now I need to take my community with me. That there has to be a
That's personal to you. What we're looking at is the Pakistani mentality with respect. We do have individuals who think at a very personal level. And there's a sense that I'm seeing more and more in our community at the moment, where overall we feel aggrieved when something broadly happens to Muslim community, but at a local level, we are the individuals now. We're so individualized, and some of this it's being, there's an advantage being taken of this now, because the more individual we're becoming, the more our children are being less inclined and being part of that very same community. And I've met some of the most admirable people who deliberately stayed in Castlefield and moved into Castlefield, worked in impoverished schools to bring them up. And you know, to me, Hiyam Molana, he's a hero for doing this kind of stuff. I have to rate him for this. But I myself, I deliberately picked at the time of all. I remember when I had quite an interesting conversation with one of my bosses about where I wanted to move to next, and I deliberately asked for Castlefield, and they thought there's something wrong with me because it's such a tough area to work in. To this day, I can walk through Castlefield without a problem. And only because I know most of the people, the kids that have grown up there and whatnot. But I think at some point we have to start looking at where people used to walk from A to B. We go in cars. There's a consequence to that. You don't say hello. You don't stop and talk to anybody in your local community. The community itself used to be, probably is to such an extent, it's still quite fragmented in elements of, there's two main villages everyone's from, and that seems to identify with their loyalties in a way. And that reminds me of the American system, where you're liberal first and then that dictates your political stance, or you're right wing or conservative, and that. And our people seem to have this thing, whether it's tribe, whether it's your village, and everything comes after that. But even that's dwindling now, because I even met kids from both sides that were absolutely sick of this politics, and they genuinely wanted to be part of a community. And they are the good kids that you've mentioned that can work within that sort of masjid environment and bring other good kids in. I think the kids that we're talking about today are the ones that are being missed by this,
So
the ones that are being affected by that consequence.
can I just jump in there? So going back, so we've moved obviously from masjids, and now we've been talking a little bit about parents, and that's good. And kind of the family structure a little bit, so that's good. So let's just like micro in on this a little bit. I like what Molna mentioned about the idea of the idea that can you the kind of helicopter approach. Like, do you want to micromanage your children in such a way that it creates a bubble that they later are unable to function holistically in society afterwards? I get that point. I think that when it's done properly, it's the only way. Because look, like we're people of deen, like we're conservative by nature, not conservative with a big C, with a small c. In that, for us, for us, we're conservative. Like for us, our law is dictated to us, what we're supposed to be doing, what we're not supposed to be doing. Allah and His Messenger have told us, and where they've left space, it's for us to base it analogically upon what they've said anyway, right? So that's a given. So if that's a given, then we're already being micromanaged to some degree anyway. So that's just the human condition. What I'm saying is that with parents, with children, I like what Saad said about the parents that are mapped out for their children. It's not to map it out where, oh, don't let them trip over, don't let them deal with a bully, don't let them. No, it's actually like a sheikh for a murid. It's actually putting them in those situations. Like if if you were conscious, for example, if I took my kid to play train, whatever, whatever, or to some area where there's like a play area, and I can see that there's somebody. I mean, I have actually done this, by the way. And I can see that somebody is not, another kid's not letting him get into a certain area, and he wants to get into it, and he's standing there feeling a bit shy. Well, I've said to him, no. Well, you've got to just do it. I can't go up and speak to him or to his parents. You've got to do it. As in, like, you can put them into a situation where they've got to deal with a bully, let's say, where they've got to do. So I think the issue about, I agree with the helicopter approach when it's done right, in that you have to, the same way I'm thinking about my life, I've got a 1-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. As the Prophet told us, to live as if you're going to live forever, meaning as if you were going to live for that time. Plan your life properly so that you can get the most out of it for Allah's sake. What about for my kids? What do I want from them? Now, whether they do it or don't do it is something different. But of course, I have to look at them and take them seriously. And I think that there's been parents, and I've seen parents, mashallah, that have done that. I live in Istanbul currently, as Mullah mentioned at the beginning. And I know a lot of families that have moved out and have very good plans for their kids. Like, I know families that have moved out solely for their kids, not because they couldn't raise their kids in England. They just found it easier in Istanbul. There was more institutions, more madrasas, more Islamic schools, private schools, Islamic schools, and they felt that they could get a better education out there. how they wanted it. They can memorize Quran whilst doing the secular, if there is such a thing as secular education, etc. So I think, you'd be surprised if somebody wanted to, and they took their kids seriously. I think that's a. But I don't know if all you're thinking about is how to extend your house, is how to buy the next house on mortgage, is how to buy the third house on mortgage. Then you ain't really got time to make those sacrifices for your kids. And I'm not saying that those are. Yani, I'm not. I don't want to be. I don't want to be offensive for no reason, and I don't want to. I'm not making judgments. We're all in this together. Like we're all stuck in the same rut, essentially. But I like that point. I do think that you have to sit down and you have to think about, where do I hope that my kids will get to, and how can I facilitate. I had a brother. I went into a takeaway, and this brother, he's middle aged, and he loves Quran. He loves Quran. And he looked at me and he goes to me, I want my kids to be qaris of Quran. And I said, okay. And he goes, I want them to go to Egypt and learn Quran, but they're too young. So I'm going to move with them. Can you put me in touch with somebody? And I looked at him and I was like, you're going to move with your children to Egypt just so that they can memorize Quran, and you want them to learn Qira'ah there, even though they don't need to move there to do that. But that was his dream. And he was so passionate about it. And I thought, subhanAllah, that's the passion that you need for your kids, because they're an amana from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whether it happens or it doesn't happen, that's in Allah's hands. But I do think the helicopter approach, if done correctly, Wallah, I do think it can work. I don't know what you think about that.
Oh, I'm not going to dwell too much on parenting. I'm the only non-parent. I'm not even married yet, so. But I did want to come in on something, and
No
a
one,
few
yeah.
things, and maybe open another avenue of discussion. By the way, I just want to say to the audience that this, inshallah, is the first of a series that we will invite tonight. We've got Saj on, and we've already got a few other guests lined up, people who have an understanding of criminality, the community, and we'll bring Saj on again at some point, inshallah ta'ala, as well. And I'm already thinking once a month we should do something like this, where we have honest discussions as a community. And the idea being, I mean, one of the things I wanted to touch on, Maulana Shams, and then I do want to slightly move away to another topic, is we have I think one of the things I've heard many brothers say in High Wycombe is this idea that, oh, I need to move with my kids to Turkey or to Istanbul, and I'm not pointing any fingers at you. You're there, academic study, and alhamdulillah, it's all good, and you're serving us as well. You come back and we take benefit from you. But there's some brothers, for the sake of my children, I want to move. For the sake of this, we have people carrying out donations, saying, oh, invest in such and such learning institution in Istanbul, help people in Istanbul, and all of this. And I sort of get that. But for me, again, it all comes back down to the idea that I'm all for helping the Ummah of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But if there's a dysfunction that's set in here, then isn't it time that we sort of start focusing more on the problems that we have at home and trying to fix institutions here, rather than running away to places where there are institutions and we take benefit from them, but not doing anything to set up institutions that we have here? I mean, one of the things Brother Bilal mentioned, he's saying, that this conversation is happening and people are here. We're hitting good numbers of people that are watching. But for us, for example, where we want volunteers, come join us, help us in these efforts, help us build a community that will safeguard the future of our children, the iman of our children. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us near the end of times, people will leave iman in droves. We have a crisis of atheism, we have a crisis of faith. People are leaving the religion of Islam for a variety of different reasons, and we need to now build very strong institutions with the idea that if there are going to be many critical crises that will hit us, we have to have the barriers in place that will safeguard us as much as is possible. I don't know if there's a link that we can put up for people who do wish to volunteer, for people to get in touch, whatever skills you have. We're more than willing to take people on, and I think this is very important. One of the things I just wanted to come back on, I mean, a few of the brothers, I've seen a few comments where people spoke about the government doesn't care, the government's cutting funding, the government is the problem. And I wanted to sort of just dwell on that slightly before we move on to some of the other topics we have here.
Sorry, Wallah, do you mind if I just comment on the Istanbul thing, if that's okay?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Obviously, you said something huge there, so we have to just ponder on it. I agree with you. Of course, it's not about just kind of ditching where you're at and heading somewhere else. And that's not. I totally appreciate that. That's not. But what I would say is that this is an individual thing. I think people have individual callings for whatever reason. I know some of the brothers that are out there, that I'm just like, oh, you were doing fantastic work in the UK. Why have you gone out? And they're like, because X, Y, and Z problem happened to my family, and I got so worried about that risk, and I didn't realize that this disease has entered my house, and I just didn't know how I was going to solve it, and so I thought I just need to take some time out, a few years. I need to go away, and I need to just create. So it's individual. Like you can never judge, any particular situation. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that actually, I remember a dear friend of mine, Niaz, from Canada, who's based out in Istanbul, been there for a long time. I remember he kind of told me about what does it mean to serve the Western community, because I've actually seen a lot of khair of certain people that have settled in certain places of the world that have opened up avenues for other communities from the West, families, etc., to come and to spend a bit of time in Istanbul, where they get some education, they get some learning, they're able to break away for a little while and have an immersion into at least a former Islamic culture, but at least where there are still remnants of that beauty of the past and are able to take something back. I've seen inspiration in a lot of kids that have come from my own family, other people that when they come out and when they are shown that place and they're introduced to certain people, they go away and they feel very, very inspired. Some of them have started praying, etc., etc., etc. So I think that if somebody was to move to Istanbul or anywhere else, they should move with the intention of keeping a link of how can they at least allow Muslims in the Western world to connect to a civilization, their own civilization of the past. And so that when they're building their new civilization in the West, meaning that when they are building their homes, long-lasting homes in the West, that they can still take that Eastern spirit with them, because it was born in the East. It's a universal religion, but they still need to take that inspiration. They need to. Otherwise, what happens is when you cut those, and this is why I have to say this: when you cut those ties. I remember I was with somebody. I don't want to. I can't mention too many things. I was with somebody that was in politics, local, in British politics, and we sat there. Some kind of interfaith thing. It's huge. Lots of people there, and somebody asked the question: are we more religious today or our predecessors of the past? The early generations of Muslims, etc. And he stood up, and he was, very preenly, and he said, "We are more religious than those of the past because we're liberal. That we wish the best for everybody, and we give everybody the space to, which is true. Of course, we do. We give people the space to do what they need to do. But the idea that when we cut ourselves off from the past, and then we adopt a liberal paradigm through which we look at our religious texts, and we start to think for ourselves what Islam should be, rather than reporting back to its sources and its scholars. I just think that going back to the East is good because it can always keep a connection there. So I think that people should become mediums. If they're going to move to the Muslim world, they should become a medium for other Muslims to take that inspiration, so that they can build those institutions in the West from which that inspiration will become local and come locally. So that's just my point. I don't think it needs to be an end all. I don't think if so many people want to move, they don't have to feel like a sellout. If that's what you feel like you need to do for your family, you do that, and don't let anybody put you off it. Right? If that is your calling, you make your istikhara, you consult with your mashayikh. However, if you feel like you are able to raise your children and to safeguard them where you're at, then alhamdulillah, bismillah.
I I'm gonna just move away from that as a point. I think one of the critiques we've had now is on the secular institutions. So let's just delve maybe slightly into them. So the idea of the local councillor, who, and especially, I mean, Sarge mentioned the idea that we have this, and I guess it's the very, very big village elephant in the room, and I think we'll probe it and see where it goes, inshallah. But the Bradri problem in our community is a very, very dangerous problem. This idea that you have this sort of tribal split between these two villages, and that dictates now the decisions that your community makes, whether you like it or not. And you could just, you got no choice. You're gonna have to sit back and enjoy the ride as they make all these decisions based on very sort of Allahu Alam. People, intentions, like you said, we don't know for certain, but there are very clear tribal splits that are very problematic, which means that it's a very difficult endeavor to sort of bring the community together as one, as the Ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as a uniform community where we have these splits happening between us. So I'd love to get this a lens on that. What do you guys think about, do we have a brotherly problem? And also now we have a lot of the young people coming through who are very disillusioned with that system, and they're struggling to find an outlet for any sort of initiatives that they want to carry out, because there's only one way, and you have to go through the tribal elders before the initiation and the, I don't know, around the fire and stuff, before you're allowed to do anything, and they're not ready to do that. That's one. And then the second one we've had is a few people coming in about the relationship with our community that does have with the police. Some people have said, there's a very strong oppositional thesis within the Muslim community that Muslims see, or a lot of Muslims in the UK, in our towns, see the police as sort of foreign occupying force that comes in, kicks us about, then sort of just leaves. I'm not saying I personally don't agree with that position, but that's a position that's become very strong, especially with the young people or the youth within our community. And somebody did mention this idea that we do sometimes call the police for help in certain issues and they don't come. So now what are we meant to do? So those two things. I mean, the idea of the Bradri is going to be a massive one. Allah alam how that discussion is going to go. But I think the second point as well about the relationship we should have with the police and how should this idea of I think the police it's hard to word certain things. I don't want to offend Sarge, but some people will see
No,
the
you're
Muslim
welcome
police
to be open.
the
You're more than welcome to be open about it. Ultimately, it's a difficult period. There's difficult questions that need to be asked, and sometimes they need difficult answering. So
so some
you don't
Muslims
get
will
this
be
opportunity all the time. So I'm happy to take any questions for that.
the Muslim police officer will be seen as the sellout guy who went and joined the system that's oppressing us. That would be a narrative that is very popular within our communities, and that's not. And I know you, Sergeant. I know you're definitely not one of those people, but that's something that people will see. So how should our relationship with the police be? And can we understand at least that there have been failings from the police side in terms of reaching out to our community and building bonds? So I mean, I don't know which one you guys want to take first, the Bradri or the. I think in this case, I mean, Bradris are so toxic to talk about that you guys would rather talk about police abuse and focus on that and pretend the Bradris don't even exist.
No, I can marry both issues together. I remember when I worked the town, each Bradri wanted to be seen. They literally tried to take pictures with me during marches and stuff, and I respected all sides. At the end of the day, if somebody's doing good, regardless of their Bradri, I'll be with them. I couldn't care less what their tribe is. I couldn't care less what village they're from. If they're doing good work and they need support, I'm there. If they're doing something bad, unfortunately, again, I'll be there, and that's part of my institution. And I don't think Bradri in itself, and I've got to be very careful how I say it, only because it can be very easily misconstrued. I don't think Bradri as a system is the problem. I think what we tend to do with it, bearing in mind it's a non-religious system in which we do expect our tribe to support us and our political moves. There are people, there's a pecking order within a Bradri system. The problem is that the Bradri system itself in this country is evolving, because in this country we don't live according to the Bradri circumstances. Like in Pakistan, your entire Bradri lives in the same village. It's dead easy. You live there. Now that model is not going to work in the UK. Mark my words, in the next 20 to 30 years maximum. We're already seeing it now. High Wycombe will be a Bradri. Reading will be a Bradri.
But the death of the Bradri has been long predicted, and the Bradri has some very powerful veins that it just sort of manages to keep on going. The 9 lives of the Bradris, in a sense.
So because money. If money was not there, I am telling you, if money and some kind of knowledge or greed wasn't there, whether it's in terms of relationships, whether it's the entrenched businesses that they have with each other, if they weren't there, there's no motivating factor. And ultimately, you could have 2 Bradris of exactly the same tribal background even. You can't, I remember somebody was sending around a funny text once that you're Asian when your dad isn't talking to his brother. And the rest of when you're on Eid, you're working out which relatives' houses to definitely not go to before Eid has even come. And this is the thing, we're so fragmented. The Bradri in itself it's a funny thing in itself. Now, I think the reputation is a big thing, and each tribe aspires to have a good reputation as best as it can. I think they've misconstrued good with influential. I think they've lost perspective on the fact what was it there in the first place. I mean, a group of uneducated people who are not trained to run an establishment and an administration, the fact they took time out to try and set one up as a masjid committee, I think is admirable. Where they lost out was when they suddenly started to have control over this. This isn't specific to High Wycombe, I'm talking generally across the country. There's been institutions now that they've decided, actually, we need to hand it over to professionals who know what they're doing. I don't see that happening anytime soon in our local communities, because unfortunately, sometimes this is where the pro that they see, but I see it as a con for Bradri, is that they also have a sense of control that comes from their strength. There's certain Bradris you just wouldn't mess with because they've got enough lads on their side. That's never bothered me because I've never had a problem with something like that. I'm not talking my Bradri versus theirs. I have 2 different Bradris, my own and my professional one. But the fact is, they're never going to out Bradri me, so I'm not afraid of it. But there are individuals who do live in those communities that will be afraid of it. Now, just touching on your, the sellout point, that's not something new. I've heard that ever since I wore the badge. I grew up having problems with the police. I got stopped, searched all the time, and none of these officers at the time, they didn't even have, they wouldn't even take the name down, and I've got no paperwork and stuff like that. So this isn't something that I'm not gone through myself at some point. The fact is, I've gone beyond this sort of victim mentality of woe is us, the police is awful. I say to all those individuals who say things like that, yeah, if you're going through a tough phase, do something about it. Join up the police or get directly involved with the police. Shouting and ranting isn't going to do anything. And I say this almost from a frustrated point of view, that there are police officers in your own town who are some of the best cops I've ever seen. And they're all Pakistanis that work within, and the specific ones I'm talking about. The ones in that station, you will hear about the 1 or 2 bad ones. You'll hear about 10 bad ones. You will never hear about the other 100 that are breaking their backs to turn around and help members of our own community, that will go that extra distance to safeguard our daughters, our mothers. They will go out of their way to protect our own community from its own zalims. You'll never hear about those because our community in sensitive cases like that won't be promoting things like that. There are elements of that station you will never see the good work, because that's not what the police necessarily does, unfortunately. What I don't agree with on a lot of things is that some of the policies that the police will have in terms of its community engagement. I have a unique position in that I know the language, I am from that community, and I know exactly how the dynamic of it works. And if I ever had a problem with some kids, you're more than welcome to ask anybody in Cripps. I did the best I could to stop as many kids as I could being criminalized. I actually went against my own management at that specific time in terms of what the definition of my role was. It wasn't to turn around and come in and arrest lots of kids. In fact, there's very few kids. I could count on one hand, probably less than that, how many kids I ever did arrest in that town. I did everything physically and legally, lawfully possible to try and change that individual's attitude towards crime, but lead them in a way that they don't get involved in crime. I couldn't have done that if I was a white English officer who didn't understand that dynamic. Now, if you have a problem with the dynamic that you're seeing at the moment from an ignorant point of view in the police, do something about it, get involved. There's no excuse that our generation has anymore that we're going to change it from the outside. I've changed a lot of things from the inside, more than anyone will care to even ask about. But that doesn't mean that we've reached the end of it, nor of my colleagues who are Pakistani Muslims who are within the police as well, and even my Indian brothers that are within the police as well, who aren't necessarily Muslim. They have deliberately, strongly, and quite ethically stuck to a very difficult job, which is not easy. There's a big consequence to joining the police, of course, but we do it because we want to make a difference to these communities. I don't ever need the approval of my own community or any community to do the work I do. I do it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to see. My family sees what I go through. My colleagues see what I will go through. At the same time, it's not about woe is me. I can't tell you how much of a qiraat I have with that notion. I really think we're stronger than that. We're better than that. We need to move on from these narratives. We have a problem with the way our youth engages with the police. We do have a problem with the way the police engages with the youth. And that's not something that the police will ever deny. You will never get the police denying that. What I do think is the vehicle to do it is communication. And that communication mode has to change. You can't keep putting that same key in the same lot. Einstein once said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result every time. It just doesn't work. So when we're the community that we say is ethical, we're moral, we're intellectual to some extent because we have an intellectual tradition, I don't know why we revert to a completely inarticulate mode of communication, which it doesn't become us. It's not becoming of us. There's people within our community who can very eloquently communicate things to the police and manage to sort out an advocacy for young people amazingly. There's, I don't think they'll mind me even mentioning their name. Uncle Daidakim used to work in Cripps at the time. Uncle Tanveer Bashir, when he used to work there. These guys would advocate a position to help not just myself, but any other police officer about why young people were behaving in the way they were. Now, they're not youth workers that will go outside and work in any youth club, and funding is an issue, and you can blame the government day and night for that, because I don't work for the government. I work for the peace of the community of the general public, and I'm actually quite proud of the fact that I'm not elected, I'm selected for the role. But the funding issue, I think, is something that our community can resolve internally. We can self-fund things. If we can fund, fantastic domes in our masjids, we can easily fund projects for our youth. If we can dig deep in our pockets to do extensions, we can put a cut of that in terms of our zakat for the year. We can put it towards a local youth project and be completely transparent about it. I don't think there's any problem with our community funding in that sense. We have plenty of astute businessmen who are constantly looking for ways that they can provide support to our charities. So I think communication, just doing things better, and mapping it out for a better way to resolve these issues. And it has been done in the past. We did it successfully with the Ramadan Kareem project that we had. I remember when over 10, I think it was 10, 14 years ago, every time historically in Ramadan Kareem, we would have kids that were just antisocial behavior went through the roof. Now, this is our religious spiritual time. Why is our own religious spiritual community, our youngsters committing antisocial behavior? We deliberately got involved with those kids. We targeted bringing them into sport projects. We had fantastic help from Wycombe Wanderers at the time. Aki, who a lot of lads know, he's the guy's made of gold. He would have patience with these kids. He would take personal time out. There was lots of people. I could mention lots of names right now. They self-policed. They helped crime diversion rather than crime prevention. And at the same time, I had an understanding with them. How do we avoid criminalizing them and setting the tone for the rest of their life that they're criminals, or this phase that they're going through, which is funny enough. I do like this guy quite a bit, Akala, who does talk about the kind of socioeconomic issues that prevalent within BAME communities. And he quite strongly advocates the position that some of these issues are phase issues. They will go through that period, and when they're older, get a bit more sense, they'll move out of those issues. Now, within that, it's if we have a scope to communicate between the police, local groups, youngsters, to be able to go down that street together to get them away and through this phase, I can't see why that can't happen now.
You know what, Jazakallah khair, there's a lot that Saad just mentioned there, mashallah. That was probably one of my favorite segments of what we've done so far. There was a lot in there, alhamdulillah. I think one big issue that you touched on was funding. I mean, we are, as a community, quite wealthy, to be honest. If we want to be honest about it, we're quite wealthy. Like we're talking about zakat. I mean, our zakat, if it just stayed here, like within our communities, like I'm talking, we don't even need to go to like a UK zakat foundation. I'm talking within the community. The masjid could facilitate this with that zakat. But I remember Sidi Khayam mentioning something to me once as well, and he was just like, "Well, you're not going to keep your zakat at home when you don't even realize that there's a problem at home. Like you don't realize that you're living next door to somebody that's a single parent." And he said to me, and he was just being honest. And he said to me, he goes, I know because I walk through the community. I know because I work with my community. So I know where they're at and I know who needs it. And there are actually a lot of people that could need that. Also, you mentioned something really good about, so that money, that funding, it could not just for poverty, which will help with the drugs, which will help with other issues as well. But also, like that money, like it can, like, for example, like you mentioned about the domes, etc. Like there's a lot of money that can be put into these youth projects that if people actually put their money into it, if they really did, you could actually, like, you could have people that are paid employees where their job is literally to work with the youth. But that, like a youth coordinator in a masjid, very rare you're going to find something like that. It's very rare that you find those. Now some certain masajid, they do have these issues. I think that was really, really important. So if somebody was to make a note of that and be like, okay, so what projects could we use? How can we fund these sorts of projects? That would be a really, really important point to take away from that. A second point, there was somebody commented saying, "What's a Bradri?" And there's a lot of comments like kind of they're like colognes or mafia or whatever. And I appreciate the sentiment. I'm not, you can have your your folly and jolly, no problem. It's all fun and games, alhamdulillah. But just to make it a little bit more serious, there's nothing wrong with a Bradri. Like where either you're going to support a football team, or you're gonna be patriotic about your country, or you're gonna be part of a certain sect in Islam, or you're gonna be like a madhab. Like it's just human nature. Allah created us in qaba'il, and and this is from his lita'arafu, right? Allah created us in these tribes. So there's nothing wrong. In fact, that was very helpful, because if you look at the early generation, a lot of them didn't need to take a mortgage because they could just borrow, and that saved them having to pay a lot of interest.
Look at the committee system; it's still ongoing.
Ongoing, yeah, of course. So my point is that no, the Bradri system is fantastic. obviously in Wycombe and in other cities, it's had a big impact on mosque politics, and that's the issue that people really have with it. People don't have an issue with Bradri; they just have an issue at the fact that you can easily get a vote in for anything, you can get elected for anything because
and
you
and and normal politics.
yeah, right. So there's a lot that, and people have a problem with that, and that's just the it doesn't feel so democratic, and that's the point. It doesn't feel democratic, and people want more democracy in that regard. But I just wanted to pull that point back, that there's nothing wrong with bradaris. Like, that's human nature. Human nature is to be part of a tribe, to be part of their own people. The issue is where it becomes toxic, and that's the same for anything. Now, that being said, I do think that we are moving away from it a little bit. I think, as Saj mentioned, that there's so many economic and marital ties that it's difficult to break away the brotherly. I can't have an argument with my cousin because I've given him my daughter in marriage. And now in that generation, particularly, if I just say they're gonna send my daughter home, like it can get that bad. It could have. But things are changing in that regard. It's not as black and white as we think. I think a lot of that negativity will start to pass, but of course it does still exist. That doesn't help us with the drugs issue though. I think that doesn't help us with the youth and violence, but I think the topic is, because somebody mentioned that as a comment, go back to the drugs, but it's a community in crisis. I think we're identifying a lot of issues at home that will push kids out onto the street, that have caused maybe mismanagement within institutions, that can create the knock-on effect of these things that we're talking about. I just want to make a point of that, because I've always said that if you can raise 14-15 grand for a march through the town, you could have put that same money into a fair where you invited the non-Muslims to that Mawlid, and that would have been excellent for da'wah. You could have given something of a little bit of fun and enjoyment for your kids. They could come in. You could have organized something really nice for them in the park where they could have gone and they could have felt something beautiful, as opposed to. But again, it's all about understanding what's happening on the ground. It's about being from the waqi', fiqh al-waqi'. It's about understanding what's actually happening in that point. And I think we are getting to that. I think we will get to that, but it's going to require a big push. Wallahu a'lam. But I do think we will get to that. I don't, the Prophet used to yuhibbul fa'al. He used to love optimism. So inshallah, I think, it's not all gloom and doom. But I had to mention that there, because most of us are from a Bradri and we love our relatives, and that's not a bad thing. Like, it's not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing when it becomes, why I say that, it's only a bad thing when it becomes toxic, or it becomes about superiority, inferiority, etc. Those are the negative things. But just to be a part of a family, well, this is traditional setup. The Quraysh, what were they? Banu Hashim, But as long as that doesn't become asabiya, and it doesn't become this kind of, how would you translate that? Kind of toxic,
Partisan sectarianism.
There's, once you see it as a supremacist thing with Asabiya, I think it often gets mistranslated to think tribalism. I mean, there was an incident, you mentioned the Blessed Sahaba. There's a really interesting point. There's the first battle of the Muslims the Sahaba had with the Banu Hanifa, who had their own false prophet at the time, for example. The Muslims actually lost, as the Khalid bin Walid spent the whole night just literally analysing what went wrong. And he looked at the regiments and they said, well, all these regiments, these people aren't actually, they're all mixed, different tribes with different tribes. And he goes, they don't know each other. And he looked at that and he thought, but I want to split them because I want to get rid of this Asabiya side of things where they're all supremacists thinking my tribe's better. And they took it to another level. They had poetry about this stuff. They would literally talk about how amazing their ancestors were, better than the others. But what he realized was that there is a positive to the Bradri, and that they knew each other. They relied on each other. And what they meant was they didn't trust another person to cover their safety. Exactly. They just didn't trust that. Yeah. So what he did the following day was he said, go back to your tribes, literally make each tribe its own regiment. Yeah. Now, this is the right point you're mentioning there, Mullah Shams, about the specifics of how Bradri is. To me, it's a tool. It's like a television. Sheikh Faisal, in fact, Shah Faisal, the one decent Saudi king there was when he introduced the TV to his people, they said, oh, it's evil, it's evil, it's evil. He put nothing but tilawat and good programs on. He said, no, it's a tool. What you use with it is what matters. I think Bradri is the same. In the same way as people, and it goes back to what Mullah Asim was saying specifically about the police, for example, being seen as a state system of coming in and oppressing the locals and going. Ultimately, a state system being used for good will always receive good praise. When it's used for something that is misunderstood or used in a way that the community will deem that to be wrong, and at times the police has got it wrong. And there's been times where they've done a lot of reviews and things and seen where they've gone wrong. it's a tool. The police in itself is a tool for facilitating the law. And not all it ultimately is done by humans. We do make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. And I'm not speaking on behalf of Thames Valley today at all, and nor should I. But in terms of my own role in giving a unique insight into the workings of it, you're not going to find anybody in the police who ever says we're perfect, we're right, we're going to get it right every time. In the same way, our community, as just bringing it slightly away from the crisis side of things, I don't think we could even do this program if we didn't acknowledge that the good that the community has actually done in itself. And here I'll touch on the fact that if we compare ourselves to other BAME communities in this country who've been longer, we've succeeded far more in business, in terms of education, in terms of we still have that aspiration. And I'll give you a unique point from my own perspective. Whenever I've had individuals who've come in, no matter how awful what they've done is, no matter how badly they're looking at time, when they're really down and they're in a cell, I've had some that will still ask for a masala. Now that says something about that individual, that they still have at that point a penitent perspective for themselves. They want to still reconnect with something, and that to me is allegorical for the rest of our community. We came here for economic reasons. Our community has done fairly well, if we're going to be really honest with it. I think the problem we now have is that we are now starting to reconnect and want a higher standard, and we should. We shouldn't just accept the fact that we have drugs in our communities. We shouldn't accept the fact that the grooming report that came out recently. It's difficult for me because I see a side of our community which your average person doesn't see, and I see the damage that it's done as well. I don't think the report necessarily, for example, was exonerating our community as much as some members of our community do see it as exonerating. The fact that grooming even happens in our community, to me, is a shame, and that is a failing. That's not similar to the drugs issue, which can have lots of reasons for why individuals get involved in that. They have similar modes of working, but they're not the same motivations necessarily. But it just comes down to the individuals and what we can do as a community to reconnect with our ethics and our spiritual kind of tradition and heal these sicknesses in ourselves.
So do you think that somebody made a comment earlier that could there be a problem with so in the community, could we, a lot of things like grooming, even drugs, as you mentioned, and you're saying that a lot of people know about it. Do you think we hide a lot? Do you think there's a lot of brushing under the carpet? Sorry, Mala.
No, I was just thinking maybe we could sort of, because I did want to mention the government report that came out recently on grooming. Obviously what the government said in that report was that it was the majority of groomers are white. And the idea that the Muslims are disproportionately represented is inconclusive from the evidence. This is from what I read of the report. Priti Patil in the introduction, she sort of makes that very clear. But at the same time, and I think there is a slight, there's a slight demonization of the Muslim community when it comes to, or the Azad Kashmiri Pakistani community when it comes to this specific issue. I mean, the idea that the abuse that takes place with Pakistanis in the gangs with the white girls is a very specific type of abuse that takes place. There's no denying that it occurs, but at the same time to recognize that the majority of sexual abuse that does happen in the UK is individual, where it's more singular white men who carry out abuse, or we have a trafficking problem where you have Eastern European girls being trafficked and things like that. The child abuse, as in the pictures and stuff that are circulating in the dark web, these are not specifically Pakistani problems. Pakistanis have a very specific type of abuse that is more strongly linked to them, not singularly linked to them, but more strongly linked to them than it is to any other community. And even within that, it's not just the idea that it was their Pakistanism or their Pakistaniness that was the feature characteristic that prompted them to do that. There are other characteristics. What's his name? Nazir Afzal, who was a prosecutor, made it very clear that it was nighttime economy, that people who work in the nighttime economy who have access to such vulnerable girls, and also the failings of the social security, the social services, or the families of the girls who didn't have protective structures around them that wouldn't allow people to take advantage of them and weren't so easily accessible to these men who did what they did, which was heinously wrong. I mean, I think there's a lot of nuance in terms of the group. Before we just say, okay, let's just move on for grooming and look more macro, I think we have to sort of narrow in and say grooming is bad, but it's been overinflated by the media. It's also been there's been disproportionate sentences given to the people who groom. Like, I admit that people should be put away, but there's an idea that there's been a slightly higher crackdown on these gangs than there are in terms of other singular paedophiles who carry out abusive acts. But I'm ready to hear whatever you have to say, Sarge, on this.
This is the issue. The report itself, let's just start with the background to the report. There's only one reason this report came out. It was politically motivated. It was a hot potato. It had to be dealt with. A lot of the vote base had pushed for something like this. I got no problem with them doing it for those reasons. It's something that needed to be looked at. But here's where the issue is. A lot of police forces didn't send through the data for this. So you've got to bear in mind, already the data is never going to be conclusive. You've got individuals at this specific state where the statistics, you can make them look any way you want to, and at the same time you have to consider the fact that you've got an issue that is two parts. You've got the street gangs on one side, unsophisticated, straightforward, in front of people's eyes, and you've got the grooming groups that are taking place online. Now, this report specifically outlined it wasn't looking at the online abuse. Now, the online abuse predominantly is not a Pakistani problem or a Pakistani issue, and it's not actually recognized as such either, and it's not promoted as such either, even by our most fervent far-right detractors. And we have to be honest about the fact that it's a grooming issue that affects every community, and our community is a strong victim in representation. But outside of that representation, we have a feeling in our community where we don't like discussing this issue, and we often, our victims do not come forward for reasons of shame, for the pure fact that you ultimately won't be able to get a rishta for that child later on if they are ever tarred with that brush. It's a horrible thing, and Allah protect all our daughters and sons from this kind of stuff. But at the same time, grooming is an issue that doesn't even just affect girls specifically. It affects families, communities, affects boys as well on a much smaller scale as victims. Now, the report itself was quite interesting because the way it painted the narrative in certain places, the language, if you look at what's happened in today's polarized society, there are already articles that came out, despite some of the exonerations that were in it, saying, well, look at the language used. They're saying most of the groomers as opposed to all groomers. And they've all automatically created an environment of a narrative amongst themselves on the far right to say, oh, this is just an appeasement exercise because they didn't tell us the truth. So we're never going to win that popularity side of things, of having people understand that we are free of this. Now, with the crackdowns were happening, I've got a bit of a controversial perspective on this. I don't have a problem with crackdowns on our community for this stuff. It shouldn't be happening. I ain't defending them, and they're not my, as far as I'm concerned, they are not my people to protect. They are still my people by default. They are a problem that we as a community should be dealing with and working with, but they are not something that I should be looking at and thinking that it's singularly a Muslim problem. I think outside of that, one of our biggest problems from that report was that the highlighting of how and what vehicles people use are being completely missed. If we look at how the group operates in terms of they will otherize individuals, there's issues of race, there's issues of denigration of their backgrounds. The other side of it is the way that they otherized people when they're selling drugs to. There was a parallel drawn between that I found quite interesting. But the report itself just wasn't conclusive enough. And the statistics in there, I would still say take it with a pinch of salt. I don't massively agree with how it was dealt with by our community. I don't think our community will even be reading most of the report. That I've had a conversation with people who've got views on it, who haven't even read the report. I don't think our community is even going to be waking up to the reality that these individuals need to be recognized as an anathema because they're so entrenched within aspects of our own backgrounds. I think...
I have like a follow-up, and I think this will be interesting. I don't know where Maulana Shams has gone, and I was hoping that he could come in on this one because he sort of mentioned this at one point before as well. Basically, you mentioned the idea that there is this otherization, that we as Muslim communities have this idea that we see non-Muslims, and one of the major things, I mean, I watched some of the documentaries that were made about this topic of the grooming specifically, but this idea was that when one of the girls who was interviewed, who was sexually abused so horribly for such a long period of time, when she was interviewed on this, she basically said they would say to me, oh, you're a disbeliever and we can do to you what you want, you're not like our girls who cover up, you you have no modesty, you have no shame, you're like such and such. And that was like a justification. I mean, it was a rationalization, which we will very, very vociferously say, nothing to do with Al-Islam. This is not what Al-Islam stands for. These guys who carry out grooming are generally people who drink, who take drugs, who use drink and drugs and many haram activities to lure these girls in. They are an anathema to this community. They're like a disease within us. We do not say them. They are representatives, like Dr. Saj mentioned, they're by default, because they're from the Ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and everybody, regardless of what faults they carry out, has the potential for salvation and rectification and tawbah.
The bar to be Muslim is a really low bar. As long as they read the kalma and the shahada, they're part of the club. Let's get that out of the way first.
Let me just jump in there if I may real quick. And we've
Can I just say one thing before? Yeah, so just to finish off that point. The thing is, the reason why I really want to emphasize this one slightly is about how we see non-Muslims within our communities or outside our communities, is because when drug dealers, I remember Dr. Qasim, and he may be coming on very soon again, inshallah, but he's a criminologist who studied drug dealers in Bradford for 4 years. He spent time with them, lived with them, and he wrote an incredible book, Young Muslim and Criminal. I recommend everybody read it. But in there, he mentions one of the justifications. I mean, there was a lot of rationalization. You would have quote-unquote religious drug dealers who would go to the masjid or have ties to the masjid, but would still sell drugs. And when they were asked for their justification for it, they would say things like, oh, the reason we can do it is because we only sell to non-Muslims, and it's allowed to sell to non-Muslims because they're not one of us, they're not part of us, and whatever derogatory terms that they would have for these non-Muslim communities. So I think that that's a point that we can sort of dwell on slightly here. The idea of how should we see the non-Muslims, and especially the idea being that there was a sort of elitism, that it was working class white people that were being abused, and that is very problematic as well. As a working class community ourselves, who suffer from a lot of the problems they do, we should have an alliance and a solidarity rather than exploiting them for the fact that they're not one of us.
I don't think there's one reason for why any of this has happened, but I certainly agree, and we did talk about this. That certainly I believe, wallahu a'lam, I believe that there is an element of, and I know maybe Saj won't. He might not think that it's the definition of racism that's perhaps accepted today, but I do think there's an element of race that plays a part. But I don't know. Like for example, I don't know whether that's the sole reason or whether that's just being used to remove guilt. For example, you'll have somebody. You may even have a Maulana, elder generation Maulana, and you'll say to him, "Oh, can I take an interest-based mortgage?" And he'd be like, "Of course you could take an interest-based mortgage." And be like, "Oh, what's your justification? Because surely interest is impermissible." And he said, "Oh, because the Prophet said, La riba bayn al-harbi wal-Muslim, aw kama qala alayhi salatu wasalam," that there's no interest between a Muslim and a harbi. A harbi is basically a non-Muslim that you're warring with. Now, there's a broader discussion that can be talked about harbi and the nature of harbi, and I don't want to oversimplify, a very complicated academic discussion in Islamic law. However, when you're talking about these things that we want to do, then you're like, "Oh, but this is Darul Kufr anyway, and they're kuffar." So somebody could have that mentality where it suits them. So in the case of where I don't want to be paying rent and I want to take a mortgage, and on the other hand, they will happily take benefits, pay taxes, and for all intents and purposes, they are fully good, law-abiding British citizens. They will vote, mostly Labour probably. They'll vote. But see this contradiction. So I wonder if the drug dealer that's got a beard, that's in Birmingham selling drugs, and there was some in Birmingham too, if you remember. So I wonder if that's just a way of them feeling okay about what they're doing. So they don't really believe it. But this is
it's a good point you mentioned there, Ustad. We have to break it down to two things here. There's the cause of why this stuff happened, and there's there's a tool of how to now do it. So the causes of it, we're saying yes, there's an element of racism and whatnot. There is a consequence of the causes, which is that in order to do it, these are still human beings that are doing this. It isn't animals coming out. Even animals have a conscience that don't harm themselves to the extent that our humans have a propensity to harm and torture themselves. In order to do this, they create a narrative for themselves, and it's a delusion. There's a really good book about this. The name's not coming to my mind right now, about delusions, where the bigger the group, the bigger the delusion. And these guys often in a peer pressure enforce the delusion. And if you read that report, the one the one area I really liked about the report in its explanations and where I thought it was beneficial was it explains this process. One of the processes is the otherising. For example, they are kuffar, they are whites, they are, we can do it because they're not one of us, we're not harming our own. Now, despite the fact that some of the victims were their own. Now, in order to do this, in order to sort of break down this ability to do what they were doing, this zulm, this oppression to somebody else, this is awful to do to anybody if you are coming from a family and then going back into your own family with that same ethical, selfless love for your children, and then you're going out and doing this to someone else's child. To be able to do this, you have to understand that these guys have to suspend their conscience. And in order to do that, they employ and exploit these narratives that are handed to them. And this kind of goes back to some of the elements I was talking about before, that within a roadman culture, it started to come in there, for example, where they will otherize the other, the gang. There's a rival gang. They are below us. They are not as good as us. That is how it starts. I'm not saying all of them are going down this road. I'm giving an example where things are misused and narratives are introduced and pierced into an individual's mindset, and then they are fermented. They're grown. They're encouraged. I mean, some of these victims were passed around by individuals who said to these girls, I am in a relationship with you. Now, for us as a community, we don't see open relationships, going out openly. I mean, having a relationship as a normal thing. We're still quite a tight community for lots of ethical, moral reasons, religious reasons. But for an English girl to commit to somebody in a relationship is within that culture is a strong moral commitment to an individual to lead on to something good. Now, we don't necessarily fully appreciate that because we don't grow up in it. But then what those lads did was, after bringing them in, started getting them introduced to other friends, now older men, and starting to get them into a really toxic environment where the girl was now pressured into, guilt tripped into doing sexual favors for others. They started introducing liquor. They started introducing drugs. They started getting them out of the home environment. Now, I don't agree with condemning or criticizing for example, the failing sort of structure of white families in terms of how the family units are suffering. Our own communities have got these similar structures now developing, and it's not their fault that's happening. I don't see that as a weakness for them. Any good or bad that a family goes through, any setup, any cultural setup, can be exploited. I think exploitation is the right word, because these lads exploited that culture's openness to now get that child into a misguided sense of belonging to them. And the problem we have is, I think, as a community that we can deal with specifically is there are elements of our community that see it happening. You can live in the local community and never see any drugs being sold, and you will never know who's a drug dealer. You could be blissfully, absolutely ignorant. And I put my hands up before I joined the police. I was one of those people. But there are parts of our community the taxi trade was mentioned by Prosecutor Nazir Officer, for example, that they were facilitating some of these pickups and drop-offs. There's a lot of criminal activity that does get facilitated by some taxi drivers and some taxi firms, not all, and it's important to stress that they're not all specifically involved in it. But the blind eye, this turning a blind eye, that was never what our community was ever about. And Islamically, it's not tenable, it's wrong. And the problem I have with it that really stuck with me is why it even came about in the first place. We're saying zulm.
No, our community is all about saving face. Our community will do anything to protect its image, and that's why they've protected certain imams. I'm not talking about Wycombe, by the way. I'm talking about just generally broadly. That's why you can have an imam that could have abused children for years, but they would have covered it up because, oh, how can you report the imam like you're somehow going against your religion or something? How can you? There's so many. We're very good at keeping face. Like that's what we do. We keep face. We brush everything under the carpet because I mean, we know. We in communities where women that may have been when they were young girls, they could have been abused in a mosque or wherever. But as they're older and they're married and they have children, they know that it'll ruin their marriages. If they were to say something like that, so they just won't do it. The risk factor is too much. So you still have that. Of course, that empowerment is growing, and we need to continue to empower people to be able to say, hold on a minute, well, this isn't Islamic. If it's not Islamic, well, we don't really care about it. Because if it's just something that's cultural, then our culture should be dictated by our religious values anyway.
Well,
And just to finish, just to say something else, sorry, just to say something else to go back, I totally agree with the point about, yes, there is an element of racism that can be put here. And there were, by the way, Mullah Asim, there were white grooming gangs too. It's not always just an individual pedophile case. There are gangs, and it's a very similar setup
I
of, of,
sorry.
of control and manipulation that gets young people to do things. I'm saying here, I'm not talking about the white community. If somebody was to say to me, "Oh, but look, white people do it too," I would say that's not why we're having this podcast today. We're having this podcast about our community. Because people will go around and they'll say, "Oh, look, the Muslims or the Asians or whatever, they don't do enough about it. They don't talk about it. They don't." But we do talk about it. Actually, we talk about it a lot. And now you're seeing it all over the place. People are talking about it. So I do think there's an
I mean,
element.
I slightly disagree with.
Let me finish
Yeah.
my point, Mullah. I do think there's an element of inferiority. I don't know whether it is actual. Like, I don't believe Pakistanis, after colonial rule, will ever think that they are superior to white British people. Okay, right? They're still using Fair and Lovely cream to fairen up their skin, right? Let's just be honest about it, right? For Pakistanis, white is right, and it's difficult to break out that narrative, right? We are a subject of colonial British colonial efforts in India, right? So I don't think that there's like an inherent, oh, because this girl is white, that these Pakistani grooming gangs are going for it. I think, as Saj once mentioned before in a previous sitting, I think accessibility is definitely there. I think the idea of otherness, of otherizing them, is there. It's almost like there could be a kind of hate, but I do think, and Allah knows best, I do think perhaps at a very subtle level, that stuff doesn't really make a difference, but it is used to remove that guilt. It's, I want to do it anyway, and I just don't want to feel bad about it. And this is a
Yeah.
really good way of me doing that. A bit like how a terrorist is violent in nature and they're extreme in nature, and they use Islam as a means. Now, I'm not justifying that, and I'm not saying that there's no potential of it being. I'm just saying these are all factors that one has to have a hard look into oneself and to see what they are doing as a community.
I just want to say on the point that because the only reason I sort of focused on the variation in types of abuse that take place and how the Pakistani community has a very singular type is just to pinpoint that we have our own factors that have led to the situation we're in rather than the different factors that other communities have in terms of their abuse that takes place. I just want to, I don't know, we actually lost like 20 viewers in a second, and apparently there's been a power cut in Castlefield Sharif. I don't know who we're going to blame for. That's it. Shall we? We could do another 2 hour podcast. Who to blame for the power cut in Castlefield? It's
No,
just
that's not a
yeah.
bleep problem, right? As long as they can't bleep us for that
Is
one.
it is the Bradris? I'm telling you, they both came. How many Bradris does it take to put the electricity back on? Allah knows best. But I think one of the points I really like to come back on, and with an idea that we've been going for 2 hours now, and maybe I mean, there's still so many points we have on the list that we're not going to probably get to discuss. But I think one of the points you do hear a lot about is this idea of punitiveness within the community. And I really want to dwell on this idea that, for example, within Islam we have this concept of amr bil ma'ruf and nahi anil munkar. You command the good, you forbid the evil. This is an institution that was there, it's in the Quran, it's mentioned by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Sahaba had an institution in place where if you see bad, you stop it, and if you can encourage goodness, you always do. And this is an institution that survived throughout Islamic history with the great Imams of this ummah. And what's happened is, and I've heard this many times, is okay, we know drug dealers. I don't, but I'm assuming people do know drug dealers within the community, and they point this out. I know who the drug dealers are. We know who they are. We know what they do. What we need to do is such, 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 and we need to ostracize them, and we need to kick them out, and we need to stop engaging with them, and we need to do, yunfaw min al-ard. We need to just remove them, exile them. We need to completely disengage with them, or we need to set up. And I've heard this one as well, and this has happened before, like in America where they got extreme poverty. Yes, like Imam Siraj and the Atlantic City and the different gangs where the Muslim community sort of, I don't want to say made their own gang, but set up a vigilante force that was now going to clean up the streets. That if you're not going to do it, if the police, where they have a lot of problems in American policing that I don't think our situation is as bad, but they carried out their own policing where they came out and they got rid of, like Ibn Taymiyyah style, break the wine jug, go all out, there was that the introduction of that, and that helped them in removing a lot of the stain. And I don't know how successful it was, but how far do you think we can go as a community, like focus. We've done a lot on causes, and I think we'll come back one day, inshallah, again to the causes, the underlying causes. But now we have symptoms in place. What are the best ways for us to deal with the symptoms that are in place? Is it exile? Is it ostracizing? Is it get the baseball bat, get the cricket bats out and go and do what you need to do, clean up the streets, literally, physically, or whatever? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. What are the
Exposing.
solutions now?
I think exposing would be a good one. So throw
But
that
then
in.
even like the idea that if you do expose them and people know who they are, that doesn't necessitate anything's going to happen on the back of that. Now everybody knows, or people already know. So now, do you know what I mean? Like, what's the next logical step that communities should take to deal with the stain or the scourge?
But I think to work with the police, like for example, like again, like you mentioned, there's a lot of things that we would never expose our own community. Whereas I reckon that you should expose these sorts of people. They should be named and shamed. Like when you talk about working with the police, what does that mean? That surely that's exactly what it means. So I'm just saying, like, if you know that within your family that you have these drug dealers, but rather than saying, well, if we tell the police they're going to go to prison, we should say, tell the police to go to prison. But
Well, why are they going to go to prison if they've done nothing wrong? What's the problem? I mean,
but that's what my point is. When you know that
yeah,
they are what they are, rather than
yeah,
covering it up so that you could come on, we have cases of people like in like let's say Pakistan where somebody could have committed murder. Money will go from the UK in
yeah,
order to try and get them mitigated by any cost. Like I mean, like for us, our moral judgment is all about this is the negative side of you could say family ties. This is where as Allah says, have justice even against your own selves, even against
yeah.
your parents. This is where that failing is happening. So I think that most people know this sort of stuff. Like people know it, but again, it's about exposing. It's about naming and shaming. Like for any again, it's all about not making taboos any longer. Like the conversations we've had today, subhanallah, like they're not being easy. Like I don't know about you. I've felt very uncomfortable through some of it, and I'm sure a lot of people listening will be like, these are not easy conversations to have. Like they're not. It's not nice to hear this about your own community, and it's not nice to put it out there like that. But it's important. I just think it's important for you to be honest. I don't think that people should be. I mean, there's a lot of like names and stuff and Cripps and blood. This is wrong. Like I think that we should avoid that sort of stuff. We shouldn't. We shouldn't. That's us. Like who are we talking about? So when we're gonna mock our community, that's us. We're talking about ourselves. So we are these people. This is us. This is who we are. The prophets when they dealt with their people, they used to say, "Ya qawmi, ya qawmi." They're my
Yeah.
people. So I don't think we should. I think we should avoid, like mockery, even as a joke. I think this is such a sensitive issue that we should take it with a lot of maturity and a lot of gentleness. But at the same time, we have to be very, very honest about it. So I would say just my final thought on that one. I think the way that I reckon that you can help is by exposing these sorts of things. If I can see within young people in my even if it's in my family or my social circle within, if I can see this brewing, I should do whatever I can in order that people realize, oh, you can't get away with anything anymore, because your own people will, they'll expose you because you're just that fed up with having this disease, so you'll cut it off yourself.
The thing is, our community, we have that there is generally a very poor understanding of what the police does, unless you're a professional that works with the police in any of the partner agencies, such as schooling, for example, or the local youth clubs. The few and far between that they are. We have a policy of young people to do the best that we can to not criminalize a young person. And where someone comes across with a genuine concern of a young person getting involved in something, for example, just touching on the drugs aspect, there are a whole host of support services that can get involved into just doing what we can to keep this person away from that. And there's a really tight schedule of management that will be involved from social services, education, police, and even local workers. There was a really interesting thing Ustad mentioned about how this colonial mentality at times, when I still see it in the police quite frequently, where they had this thing in colonial times where the English officer would say, "Bring me your village headman. He will deal with the rest of you minors. Bring me the major out of you, and then he will go back with my message and he will feed me." This doesn't work in our community anymore. In one family, everyone is the leader. Everyone is the big dog. No one gets told what to do. The village headman trick doesn't work with our people anymore. When it comes to abuse, though, totally different issue. When internally speaking, if I told you in our child abuse departments, for example, that we investigate, the overwhelming majority of people involved in those cases are people known to the victim. They're hardly strangers. They're known to the victim, whether very close family friends or they are directly family. Now, at a local level, specific familial level, I'm not advocating start looking at your relatives with suspicious eyes, but I am saying that your child's safety, security of your daughters is your responsibility, and sons. It's an uncomfortable conversation our community doesn't often want to have, even when it comes down to homosexuality. We do have guys that are interested in guys in our community. We can say it's not Islamic, and you can bring every fatwa under the sun, but that doesn't stop this stuff happening, and it doesn't stop abuse, for example, happening where you have pedophiles that exist in our community, and it's to this day the hardest job that I can ever deal with, and I have no shame in admitting the biggest breakdown I ever had in my job, emotionally dealing with something, was a paedophile case. It just hits you. If you have children, it absolutely mortifies you to be involved. Now, that's as a professional dealing with this on a fairly regular basis. You imagine a member of our community seeing something like this. The first thing our community will do, I should stop using the word community, an individual within a family will do. You'll have two sides. One side will say the child is lying. Of course, the child is lying. Absolutely, the child is lying. We know this man. He wouldn't do this. The other side will be like, I know he's done this because it's happened to me. And then people come out of the woodwork. I think the keeping up appearances is a huge, it has pros, it has cons. I think we have to recognize that the cons are now so serious that they're massively outweighing the pros. I think the fact that I think Karima locally did a project with the stayover where you had specifically single gender only, and ideas like that for sleepovers. That was a fantastic idea. Our children shouldn't lose out on sleepovers for these reasons. But within my own family, I have never allowed my children to have a sleepover without a parent being there, or in an environment where there is single gender only. And there's elements of where I have to be really careful in my home life that I don't bring too much of my job home. There's times that it's so difficult to deal with some of the things that I see, that I would really love to go to town on elements of our community and tell them bluntly those harsh conversations with them, that the pride that you're taking and the defensive attitudes that you're having about us. I swear to God, if you knew the reality of some of the most risk-carrying positions that you're in, and the people that are absolutely exploiting that and abusing our own young kids within this, you'll never let your kids come out of your house. And we shouldn't be afraid of that. We should put in safeguards for that, is what I'm saying. Now, I don't think we're ever going to come up with a solution for every single situation tonight, and I don't think that any one person has the answers. But certainly, from an angle of the police side of things, at the very least, in terms of as an agency, Ustad was right that we should be approaching the police where we come across a case like this, because they are specially trained to deal with this. I have colleagues that I saw one earlier today, and the man, you will never meet him. Inshallah, you don't either. But the man is a hero. The amount of absolute zulm he deals with on a daily basis that he sees, and yet he does the most professional job in treating respectfully these individuals who commit these absolutely heinous crimes. Right? It's I can't even verbalize it. I have seldom seen our own Muslim people have that kind of just ability to handle themselves, and I think to be able to put the problem down to our community and say you're all now going to have to completely deny this issue exists. It doesn't exist. We're Muslims. It's not a Muslim issue. I agree it's not a Muslim issue because it's not happening because we're Muslims. Let's get that clear. But I think there's issues within us as Asians, broadly speaking, amongst all Asian groups, and this is coming into our Bangladeshi and Indian brothers as well, that this keeping up appearances process, this trusting of male relatives within a family completely blindly, I think that's a problem. We should be suspicious of everyone when it comes to our children, both for their education, where they're getting it from, the groups that they hang around, the relatives that come home. There are behaviors and changes in behaviors that we don't often see in our young girls. And often when I hear the stories of the victims and I read some of these cases before sending these cases to the Crown Prosecution Service to recommend charges, you look at some of these stories and it's so moving about the fact that the families just said, you know, I'll say it in our Patari tongue, like, and you know, to say it for our non-Patari speaking viewers, it's basically, I don't know what's wrong with her, why she's gone quiet, just get on with it. that getting on with it, it's easy for that parent or elder to say they have no idea what that child is hiding. Why? Because we have given so much onus to our own siblings and whatnot, for example, and other relatives. Relatives, sometimes even people who are not related to you, but they're so close to your family. They're probably already mapping out how to manipulate yourself into having access to your children. Now, if that's happening within the family and we're blind to that, I'm not surprised that we're blind to the grooming that's going on in our community. We are not the singular biggest grooming community in this country at all, but we're not inoculated against it either. We've had victims. I think the biggest tragedy out of this report was on two sides. One, that the focus on Pakistanis as groomers was so tragically bad that there was a doctor, the professor called Ella Cockbain, who raised issues about the Quilliam report, for example, that was shambolic. She raised the issue that actually the tragedy for white girls that had white predators on them, no one wanted to listen to their story. For me, the other side of the tragedy also is that there's young Asian girls who do not want to break their family or their Bradri apart. They don't want to set one side of the family against the other side. They have family, they'll even have parents that will shut them up. Don't say anything, you'll wreck the family. Sometimes, you know, in Billah, you know, may Allah punish the Zalims for these things. There's even a parent being the person committing these offences. Now, where's the honesty? Where's the safeguarding? Where is that sense of accountability to yourself in the hereafter? Like, that child is in your charge. I think these are the conversations we need to start having amongst ourselves, at least amongst ourselves within our own families. Shut the door, talk to your children. Do they ever feel vulnerable in front of a relative? Is there something that we could do? We shouldn't be assuming our children, no matter how streetwise they are, no matter how savvy you think they are, and they purport it, we should never underestimate the fact that they could be groomed within our own house. Grooming is not an issue that just affects white girls. It also affects our own girls. And these devices that they have created an inroad into your own houses. You could be groomed sitting, your child could be groomed sitting right next to you, and you wouldn't even know it because the person they're talking to is slowly prizing them into a relationship. There's various offences I can talk about all day long about how and what, at which point it becomes an offence. And, you know, there are young lads who do want an honourable relationship with a young girl that don't know how to do it any other way. They will want to date in a normal way. They'll be seen as a groomer. That's a topic for a different day. But I think the uncomfortable conversation we need to start having is, where are we letting our own children down? Children are very resilient for a lot of things. And before these things become manifest in behavioural changes at home, you've got to ask the question, how long has this abuse gone for? And if I genuinely wish, if data protection didn't exist, and I could tell you about half of these stories, it would break the heart of our community, and then you would understand why we have the conviction we do as officers often to engage with people the way we do sometimes.
Do you think that is? I mean, again, that's more the reason. I mean, I saw a comment here about if I've ever reported any drug dealers or criminals to the police. I'm not quite sure why that was specifically targeted at me. Is it because you don't agree with the fact that you should do that and you're upset for me to mention that, or do you feel like it's something that I'm saying but I wouldn't do? I don't know. Like I don't know. I don't know whether it's an accusation. The question, I don't know whether it's an accusation at me, like of hypocrisy, or whether it's I don't agree with what you're saying. Would you do it yourself, or whether it's just an honest question about have you ever done it? Well, to be honest, I mean, I don't live in Wycombe. I live in Istanbul, so I don't really know any drug dealers, unfortunately, in High Wycombe right now. And it'd be a bit odd if I did, probably. But I mean, I could again. I mean, but wallahi, billahi, tallahi. Like if I knew that there was like, let's forget drug dealers because Saad just gave us a very emotional bayan about child abuse. But like I if I was to hear of something or get a whiff of something, absolutely, I would. Look, these are no brainers. But of course, if you haven't yourself witnessed anything like that, then you can't really, or if you don't know of it, then you can't really expose it or bring it forward.
Can I
But I
just
have to
say,
say something. I have to say something. I have to say something. One other thing. That does not mean that I'm not afraid. Like for example, in our community, it's not to say that I am not afraid of exposing, like of mentioning something, particularly when it comes to abuse, and particularly if it was to ever come up about elders or religious people or things of that nature. Absolutely, like the pressures are immense in our communities. The pressures are immense. I mean, like they are immense. We're still a community that is scared to go into the masjid sometimes without wearing a hat. Like the pressures are immense. you'd be surprised. So yeah, I'm not going to deny and say that I wouldn't be afraid to be a whistleblower on something, because I would be. However, you know, would I do it? Inshallah. Of course, you can easily approach someone like such. Like, it's so approachable. You can easily go and just say, "Look, I think this is happening. What do you think I should do?" You can get advice at least.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that difficult as people. But I'm still a bit confused as to why I was asked the question directly.
I just want to. I think one of what the point you're really narrowing down, Sarge, is the idea that abuse is not a singularly Pakistani community problem. There is a tidal wave right now. There is a massive tidal wave of grooming, of sexual abuse, of online trafficking, of I mean there was a recent New York Times article, I think it was, about children being inadvertently, without any idea of what was happening, being forced into producing pornographic material that would now end up for people's use on the internet. There's all this craziness that's happening. What you seem to be suggesting is that we haven't given us, or we're not utilizing the tools to defend our community.
Yeah.
We're putting certain priorities over others. There's tribal affiliations, family bonds,
We don't
kinship
think it applies
structures.
to us. We
J-
don't think it exists. We don't think it's a Pakistani issue. We don't think it applies to us. We don't think you hear about pornography, underage girls' images online in different places in the dark web. Half these pictures, I guarantee you, are coming from young lads getting nudes from their girlfriend in school that another lad will get access to and then start either using back on that girl or selling on to someone else. This stuff does happen. Our girls, if they've got cameras, it just happens. We're human. It's one of the biggest, most hardest things for a young person to kind of control is their hormones. They're coming into an identity. There's a lack of understanding about how to conduct yourself in stuff like this. There's a very straightforward, very hard kind of pressure put on a young person saying, you just can't have a relationship. If I ever find out you've had one, I'll bloody come for you. And that doesn't say to them, look, there will be a time that you will want to. Let's have a plain conversation. I advocate to every young girl, if any viewers got sisters or anybody, just tell them, no matter whatever happens, whatever position you ever find yourself in a relationship with anyone else, and this goes for any adult, don't ever send any nudes to anybody and get yourself into a position where you will be absolutely manipulated potentially by someone. This happens. We can't pretend it doesn't happen because we're Pakistani. At the same time, our Pakistani lads sometimes. I work in an environment where sometimes I'm angry at seeing some of the stuff and the most ingenious ways some of our lads do crime. I feel sad at the same time when I see this, but also at the same time, there's an element of which I just look at them and I feel absolutely ashamed sometimes. And this whataboutism that but other communities do it. Imam Mukhtar once said, "They are not our teachers." Rahimullah. This is not something that we should be saying, well, they do it too. They're not the barometer we should be. That's a low bar to set ourselves. We're saying we're the ethical community. Why should we be allowing it?
I just want to here's I guess where we start coming to a close in the conversations that we've been having. This will not be the first conversation we have. I think the idea of sexual ethics and Muslim relationships with marriage and a lot of those conversations are bigger conversations that will need their own program. I've got some people, Ustad Mobeen Vaid, lined up. Maybe I'll bring you back on, Sarge, for that one and we can engage in that conversation together. We're hoping Mullah Shams sticks around in the UK for a bit and hopefully we can have him on again. We don't know how the Wi-Fi is in Istanbul, so we'll see what happens with that, inshallah. But now, just coming to the closing ideas now, we sort of really emphasized that this was going to be a solution-based discussion. And I think the solutions have come intermittently throughout our discussion. We've propped up certain solutions to certain problems and ideas that could be put forward. But now at this point, as we come to a close, I mean, again, for the drug dealing, somebody, there's been a recent in the chat, they've just been saying about vigilante groups, and not vigilante groups, but the neighborhood watch, so to speak, that we need to go out, do the walks. I mean, we've spoken about this, Mullah Shams, and we're going to hope, I don't think we have time to go into it in too much detail, the methodology of da'wah. the failings that we've had in the way that we've tried to spread the religion to our youngsters has caused a massive dissonance, that they're not associated with the religion, they don't see that it relates to them, they don't see in terms that they understand, and that's caused a massive problem as well, in terms of the solutions that we're trying to give to people. And sometimes there is this clear understanding that the religious community is really out of touch, stuck in their little bubble discussing the Minhaj al-Abidin of Imam al-Ghazali, but instead, while on the ground there's a lot of stuff going on that they're oblivious to. I mean, I still want this idea of dealing with the drug dealers, wood vigilante groups. I'd love to get your views on that side first. But then after that, just ideas on possible solutions that we can now put forward. Do we need a neighborhood watch? Does Karima need to start? I mean, what could happen now is basically we could put 100 different solutions out and say, here's the 1,000 things we need to do. And, you know, all the way from set up sports clubs and all the way to revive the Khilafah or something. But there's all these different steps that we need to take and all these multiple approaches. But at the end of the day, human beings are you know, we have weaknesses. We're only out of the, you could say 100, we'll probably only be able to do 2, and even that it won't be as good as it should be. But ideas on what can you think as more micro solutions that we can now start implementing as local communities to develop these institutions? What institutions are more important than others to deal with the multiplicity of problems that we are now facing?
You're right. Some of the most biggest things start from the smallest things. I think it has to be relevant. It has to be easy. It has to be something convenient. I think some of the you can set up a system locally to say we'll get a vigilante group taking on every drug dealer. The truth of the matter is, firstly, it's not lawful. You're putting yourself into big problems as well. You're also putting yourselves at risk unnecessarily. You know, why not put the risk onto my colleagues and myself? We're paid to do the job. Our families have signed up with us to these jobs, as have all of my colleagues. Put it on us. There is nothing wrong with saying to the police, you know what, this is a proposal we're giving you guys. You have local neighborhood teams that can assist you with different priorities that you can come forward with and say, these are the problems we're having. We're willing to give you X, Y, Z in terms of whether it's information about what these guys are up to, but also you can make an accord with the police. And I know I used to do it at the time when I was a neighborhood officer in the local area. And I worked in Wycombe for many, many years. And one of the things we did was, look, we're going to come to you about frank information about this young individual, but we want them to move away from this path. My interest in there was, as long as they stop the criminal side, I'm happy. That's the police ultimate aim, is to reduce crime. For the community or that individual or that organization, it will be, we want that, but we don't want to protect the child. We want to save this child. You know, this child is to be seen as a survivor from this, not as a victim of this, to go down for a system because of someone else has initiated this from the top down. I mean, one question someone once posed to me was about rival drug gangs when they're fighting each other. Who's the real winner? I'll tell you who the winner is. The winner is the person supplying the drugs to both sides. You know, I'll tell you who the losers are. Everybody, including those rival gangs, their families, the victims, the people they sell to, the young boys that look up to their material gains. They don't tell people what they put themselves through. I could tell you very, very easily, it's a dog's life being a drug dealer. You won't believe the zillah these guys go through, the awful stuff that they live through. They won't tell you that. They won't glamorize any of that. But you're never going to convince a young person who sees a flashy car and a guy who's, you know, buying 10 chicken burgers with his mates and, you know, buying all sorts of counterculture goods and living the life. You just won't pursue that level of thinking with them. I think if there was a system in place where we as a community just stood up and said, right, we're not going to have it anymore. We will shop at every drug dealer we see. How's a drug dealer going to know exactly who gave the intel if you are able to approach the police anonymously and give the information? I've always felt that how can you hold one person down when the entire community stands against you? Years ago, Castlefield had an issue with the fires that would have taken place. I'm not going to go into that because the investigation's over and been and done with, and people move on. But the fact is, when the whole community stood up, and there was a sister who I remember to this day, with a lot of respect, she was very courageous. She stood up, and you know, one of the relatives or those lads was right in that room, and she literally pointed the finger at him and goes, "I'm sorry, but your kid is a bastard." And she used that term, and I'm proud that she had the guts to say that, and she said it with so much, almost like a sigh of relief that it had to be said. The community had got to that level. Everyone was ringing in. We must have had 10 to 20 calls a night about these guys saying, this is where they're going, this is what they're up to, this is what they're about to do. And eventually they were caught. Did they ever stop? Well, a leopard can barely change his spots. But this is the thing: when a community works together to sort an issue out, it does get sorted to an extent. You just got to stay on it. Drugs is no different. If there is a community that says we are not going to let this stuff happen in our community anymore, watch how these things change, because you won't tolerate it anymore. You won't give the respect to these big flashy cars and huge extensions that are happening out of nowhere. I mean, none of these kids are multinational company owners. They know where the money's coming from. If the community had a way of A, giving information, B, coming up with a plan, and then working with the police, like as I said before, the police doesn't always have the answers. But I think we need to give the answers to the police as to what we think we can do. Sit down in a room with the local officer and say, look, what can we do lawfully? I don't see anything wrong in a group of people from a neighborhood watch doing regular walks and seeing what's going on in the area. And there's nothing stopping you guys engaging young people and saying what you're doing wrong. This has happened as a tradition within Castleville historically for a long time. But I think we have to be, these solutions have to be convenient, and they have to be as low risk as possible. Otherwise, you won't bring people on side for it. And anonymity is one of the best ways of guaranteeing it, I think.
Maulana Shams, in terms of solutions that you possibly beyond, I understand the idea that we need to sort of get the police involved and using the police, but even thinking about solutions beyond just the singular, sort of more causal issues. That what can we do as religious communities to stop the seeds being cultivated and the water being put on them before coming to the final stage where we have no choice but to turn to the police? Because ideally, with all due respect to Sarge, and I think he'll agree with me here, you'd rather not get the police involved. You hope that you can facilitate the fixing of the situation before it gets to a stage that you have to criminalize your own people, put them into prison, remove families, destroy families, break mothers' hearts. These are not things that we do lightly. These are very, very difficult situations that, the singular example that always breaks my heart is the idea, if you look at what happened to the black community, when their communities were literally burning down around them, they had no choice but to invite the police in, who carried out horrendous activities at times, but they had no choice because the community needed its salvation. How many mothers are willing to sacrifice their children for the materialistic greed of drug dealers? It's not viable. They will invite the police in, and the police will do what they have to do. And I still feel the policing in the UK is much better than the policing in America. In America, they have major issues in terms of police abuse and things like that happen. But nevertheless, we do not want to invite people in to fix our communities if there are causal issues at the very least that we can sort of mitigate before they get to that stage. What possible ideas do you think, micro, macro, just if you could just...
To be honest, Mullah, right, of course, I agree with you. What I meant when I said about engaging with the police is that we have to break this narrative that we do not whistleblow in our community ever, and that people can get away with whatever they want, and we will have to keep face. I'm really disgusted with it. I hate it. I don't think it's a good thing. Allah protect us from having to ever blow that whistle. We don't want to be in that position. That's not a comfortable thing. They say about the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't even used to like waking people up for prayer. The idea that he was so gentle with people. But my point is that, so if you make a few examples of, as a community, that we will not stand by this, it can, like hudud punishments, stand as a deterrent. We don't like the hudud punishments, but they are there as a deterrent. We translate the word as deterrent punishments. So putting that bit aside, so that was my when I said that, that's why I said that, and I believe that, and I could be wrong, but that's just my opinion on that. In terms of causal, absolutely, I think we've, in the last 2.5 hours, mashallah, we've identified a lot of problems. I think looking at those problems. So, for example, we had with Karima lockdown on a Friday night, sometimes Saturday night, etc. But we had over 100 kids. Mullah Asr, remember that, right? Over 100 kids, off the streets in to have some pizza, to play some cricket, to play some football, to play some PlayStation, to do some wrestling. That's 100 kids that were off the street, that were inside the. That's 100 more than there are right now because of the pandemic, for sure. But my point is that these sorts of things about giving them alternatives, being there for them, allowing them to be space for them to go into where they have older people, where, as Aki was mentioning earlier, where they can have role models, etc. In the comment section, he was mentioning those sorts of things. The local masjid, if it was inviting, if these kids were invited in through food, through play, through activity, etc., you can save. You're not going to save everybody because shaitan is always doing his work and the nafs is always amara bisu. So you're always going to have this for sure. You're going to have people there. Lastly, I'd like to say, and so many people in the comments, and I've kept an eye on the comments, have mentioned this, is that you like the first priority is always going to be on the parents. Now they're not always going to be capable of doing that because they may be going through a lot of issues themselves. This is why single parent families, for example, they struggle. They got to fend for their kids' food, how they worried about, etc., etc. We know that. So then we have to look at all of these organizations. Is there enough zakat be pumped back into the community if there's need for it, enough sadaqah, etc. But if I was to give two or three main things, I would say, well, look, as a parent, I can't expect, as some we mentioned earlier, external forces to come and rectify my children. I've got to take that. I've got to take that seriously. I've got to begin thinking seriously about my children, and obviously, my children are going to learn from my behavior. So I can tell them as much as I want to, but as long as I'm not fulfilling the basic, I mean, of what I should be doing, of course they're going to go astray. So I think parenting, parents have to, and there's, I think Karima's doing the father and son. They're doing this, the father and son bonding sort of thing. I mean, maybe you could remind me one, but like so, like there has to be, a way of parents taking sole responsibility to begin with. Then our masajid have to understand that these children, it's not just about teaching them alif ba ta, but it's about facilitating for their Islam, for their ihsan, for them to grow to be righteous young men and women. So I think if we, and I'm, it may sound like, oh, but this sounds very basic, but it's not being done. That's the thing. It's actually not being done. So if we've got a few grand in the bank, I think that there should be some serious think tanks where the masjid, and I speak very openly, they should, like, I mean, this is the problem, but to actually bring people in and to sit down and to talk about it and say, all right, we've got a problem in Carsfield, for example, right? Let's focus on Carsfield. So you have a think tank just for Carsfield. And now the masjid says, what can we do? Can we bring local businesses in to help fund? What can we actually do to help this problem? But unless that happens, then, it's just Karima trying to fight a bit of fire with their capacity they've got without the support of the wider community. So that's just, I mean, maybe that sounds quite unsystematic now that I think about it. But I think I would say if parents take responsibility, if the masjid takes responsibility, if the community is bought in, because the masjid has to bring people in, you need central authority. You have to give people a place to come in. Otherwise, where are they going to go? They're just going to walk around Castle Park. What are they going to do? Whereas there has to be an onus that's taken by the people that have been elected to serve the community. Like when you are elected in the masjid, you are essentially saying, I am going to help facilitate the spiritual and religious well-being of the community. That is what you are saying. That is a half and a half. Like that is an oath beyond measure to take such an oath. So when that happens, you have to think about these sorts of things. So I would say, if somebody was to write that down for me, I would say that there has to be funding pumped into that, and you can get that funding. And I would say that people at home have to really, really think about how they're raising their children. And I think some people like it. I think some people like to raise their children as material monsters. I think they love the idea that my son's going to be someone very big and bada aadmi banega, wo aisa hoga, wo hoga, and we're going to show my brother's family that we know. Yani, this is what you're pumping your children with, and then if they can't get it in any other way, they're going to get it in the way that they may end up in prison or even dead. So, wallahu alam, I don't know if that's offered any solution, but I do think that we have to take more responsibility for it. That's just it. As a parent, I have to take my responsibility. As a masjid, we are the community. The masjid is the community. What else? What else is the purpose of the masjid? What's the purpose of the masjid? Otherwise,
Subhanallah. Very, very powerful. The idea that the masjid is the heart of the community, and it has always been. I mean, I remember I was in Turkey and one of the teachers was saying, the masjid is the hub where everything begins. The Prophet ﷺ began the da'wah, would begin in the masjid. The wufood would go out from the masjid. The jihad would begin from the masjid. Everything would happen. The
the
masjid was the...
delegations used to come to the Prophet in the masjid.
Sallallahu Alaihi
Sallallahu
Wasallam.
Alaihi Wasallam.
Everything. The masjid was the center point, and that's a very powerful institution that we have let down. And the idea, I think there's one point, and I really want to push this because this is a point that Tali always makes, and I think he's so right to say this. Akil always says this, and he's somebody that's come up a few times now. May Allah honor him and bless him and make him one of the denizens of the Garden of Paradise, an incredible figure who does a lot of khidmah for this deen, and we ask Allah not to let arrogance into his heart. But the point he does make is, as somebody who's always on the ground, doing everything he can, putting all the legwork in, is the idea that people will sort of begin the journey with you, but once they see the difficulty inherent in the struggle that you have to do, they just sort of move to the side. What can I do? What difference am I possibly going to make? Imam Mahdi's going to come and fix everything. We're going to be fine. Don't worry about this stuff. And there's this, and it's a very difficult task. I was saying recently that you can point fingers at all the committees in the world. If the committee tomorrow was to decide I'm not going to do my job anymore, would we as a community be able to bring people to stand up and do the hard slog that is needed in order to get things done? And I don't think necessarily that is true. I think even for myself, I don't know, like the sacrifices people have to make, the sacrifices the Sahaba made, the sacrifices those early generations made, and the Ummah has made throughout, are very, very difficult decisions and choices that we have to make. But I do want to say again, please, inshallah, send email Karima if you want to help us, be volunteers. Don't be like, the weeping of the Moor, like Sultan Muhammad of Granada, who, as they left to let the Christians come in and take back Muslim lands, he started crying, and his mother said, "There's no point crying now when you didn't defend it like a man. Why cry like a woman when you didn't defend it like a man?" And I think we have to be very clear about, we are at a crossroads, and we have to now understand that and be ready now to make decisions and choices that will be very important for the safeguarding of the faith, predominantly the faith of the children of this community, inshallah ta'ala. I just want to finish. We sent an anonymous sort of it's like a monologue, it's like an autobiographical paragraph that somebody sent us about experiences they had, and they're very adamant that we read it out for the people, and I've been told by the higher up that I should read this out. So inshallah I'm going to read this out, and then maybe I'll ask Maulana Shams to make a short dua as we finish. He says, "This is not a poverty issue anymore. I'm 15 years old, and at the time I thought I was just a part of a group of boys chilling out and hanging around. And then soon came drugs and knives being involved. At first, when I was a part of them, I thought we were a group of friends. We talked about personal stuff together and we were very close. But slowly we started hanging around with older boys who would smoke cannabis and would offer it to you. You would say no a couple of times, but then your friends are doing it, and the pressurization or the pressuring, they're pressuring you to do it. Yes, you are responsible for your actions, but when a person nags you on again and again to do something, and the people around you are doing it and nothing happens to them, you are going to do it. And this is the first stage. And whilst you're doing it, they will take in videos, which are then used to blackmail you, to ensure you don't tell anybody, and to ensure that you're constantly scared of them. They then start making you buy drugs from them, and then money becomes a problem. And that's when they offer to give drugs to sell, and you do that, and you feel like you can't get out of it, but you can. People start holding knives to protect themselves from other people who are selling drugs. This is not the only reason in this day and age. Social media has changed everything. You see rap videos, music videos, at the start of the videos putting a disclaimer that they don't condone these actions. These are only for entertainment purposes. But young children want to be like them and act like them. As silly as it sounds, kids pick these knives up for a type of street cred. I was part of a group at the time thinking we're just a group of friends. But slowly we started chilling with older boys, and everything that I said before started to happen, and I was slowly roped in. My family started to get an idea when they saw me living the great life I thought I was living, and asked me if I needed help. And I said, I'm fine, I'm not doing anything wrong. But then it got to the stage where I got in too deep, and alhamdulillah, they caught up and separated me from them. They knew everything I was up to, but I still denied it. The only reason I told them where I was or what I was doing is when I realized these people don't care about you. They are there to use you and gain something from you. These boys till this day are still trying to contact me, but I haven't had contact with them for around 3 months. I deleted my social media, and my family took control of it. If we could do something to stop this from happening from the start, maybe inshallah no one will proceed to the last stage when they are too far deep in. I'm listening to the talk whilst writing this, and I can hear people talking about being a part of a gang. In my personal experience, I didn't believe I was in a gang, but more a group of friends. Now looking back at where I was, and if I hadn't stopped hanging around with them, only Allah knows what I would be up to. I think that's a very powerful reflection that young brother has.
Amazing. You know what? Respect to the young person for writing that. That's an insight. You could see it's heartfelt. And the fact is, it comes right back down to the fact that this is not something that, as a copper, I can denigrate every drug dealer under the sun, as my colleague can. But the fact that there's pressures and there's deeper issues behind it makes it all the more important that this is why we're together talking. This is a child reaching out. There's other children trying to reach out, and unless we do something about it now, Allah Nakare, it might be one of our sons tomorrow. It might be, one of our nephews tomorrow. And all those people that are like, this would never happen to us. Every parent that this has happened to has felt that at some point. This will never happen to them. And, you know, there's elements of shame in every family. There's a conscience in that young person, alhamdulillah, that was never lost. And there's an innocence in that individual that remained intact. How many other young kids didn't lost that on that journey? And at that stage, you know, there's nothing that Maulvi Sahib can say in the masjid that's going to move you away from that level of manipulation. But what I'd say is, you know, bless that person for sending that through. That's really moving, mashallah. It's really important to hear that.
Subhanallah. Um, I mean, if you have any last reflections, now would be the time to share them, inshallah. Otherwise, I'd ask Mohammed Shams. Go ahead.
I just want to say one final thing. For me, it's about two things. There's accountability and justice. They're the two most important things, I think. After all these years of thinking different things are different important, you know, matters, these two things are the most important for me, I think. There's accountability is you hold yourself and your loved ones to the same accountability that you hold the world against. And to this day, I even wear the Zulfiqar for that same reason. When I read something by Imam Junaid, he literally said, why the young Sayyid had come to him and he said, tell me of my ancestor. And he said, do you know the reason why Mawla Ali had Zulfiqar had two blades on it? One was against the world and one was against himself. He held himself to the same account he held the world against. And justice is specifically on the same thing. It's about having mercy at the same time as doing the right thing. Sometimes we think going to the police or doing something about something, it's going to be detrimental. No, sometimes you might be saving that person from a further wrong later. Allah, this is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where he turns around and puts you through a minor calamity now to save you from a disaster later. And our people don't see that. They see any crisis as awful. Every tradition, every, you know, blessed thing that's come to our people has always iterated. A calamity is better than a disaster. And the people who love Allah Ta'ala prepare themselves for disasters. We're that community. Why should we be shy from that? We should have broader chests for this kind of thing. And I'm really grateful you guys had this conversation. And I know it wasn't easy for you guys to have somebody affiliated with the police on there, but I think it was really brave of you guys to do that. And I hopefully didn't make any words too diplomatic and was as honest as I can be. But if I made a mistake anywhere or if I hurt anybody's sentiments, then I apologize in advance. It's not my intention. And I wish only the best for the High Wycombe community. It's got some of the best people I know working there, alhamdulillah, including yourselves as well.
Alhamdulillah.
Barakallah fikum. Yeah, we're very fortunate to have had Saj with us and before as well, and you know, private meetings as well. You know, like not private as in secretive, but just personal meetings over dinner and stuff. And it's been great company. So Alhamdulillah, Allah Ta'ala bless you and protect you and your family and your children. Just because you ended on that note of justice and self-justice. I remember Sayyidina Umar when he appointed Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As as a governor of Egypt, and Amr ibn al-As's son, you know, who had a moment of arrogance because his dad was the governor, and he became offended that somebody's horse had gone in front of him. So he said, "How dare does your horse go in front of my horse when I'm the governor's son?" So when this news, the man was upset and he went to Umar and he said, he went all the way from Egypt and he meets Sayyidina Umar as one report that they're making tawaf, and he says to him, "You're the Amir that everyone speaks about, your justice, and this is what happened to me. I was Zalil, I was like, I felt Zalil." Debased, I guess, is a good translation for that. And Sayyidina Umar called from Egypt Amr ibn al-As and his son, and he said to him, "Is this the one that did this to you?" And he said, "Yes." So he gave him his stick. And also, apparently, he hit him with a stick or something. I forget the detail. He hit him with a stick. So he gives him the stick. He says, "Hit the governor's son the way he hit you." You know, and I think that is like that's huge because you know Amr ibn al-As and Sayyidina Umar are very close. I mean, this is deep Qurayshi links here. They've grown up together, etc. And that's his governor. He's conquered Egypt for him as a caliph, right? And so Sayyidina Umar, when he became a caliph, he sits all of his sons down and he says to him that don't think that because you're my sons that you're going to get off light. If you do something, you'll get double the punishment. So I just think that, you know, these are stories, but they're there for a reason. You know, and I just think that as, you know, growing up, you know, we have to take these things very seriously about when I'm raising my kids. If I start to get an inkling, I may have to take extreme measures. As you mentioned, it may be short term now, it may be hurtful, but in the long run, it may save my children, you know. And Allah says, "Qu anfusakum wa ahlikum nara," save yourselves and your family from the fire. So we pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He protects our children. It's not easy. There's no book written on parenting, but I do believe that there's huge onus that has to be on parents in how they're raising their children, and that doesn't mean that they just force feed them Islam, or ethics that they think is good, but it's about that they think and they deeply reflect on how they can raise their children in a positive way, in a way that's going to allow them to grow up to become positive, as opposed to being negative, or in any way. Again, and I mean that even religiously, because the last thing that you want to do is to raise somebody with force feeding them so much religion that they end up beginning to despise it. But to raise them with that kind of love, and may Allah give us hearts that love so that we can do that. Maybe there's a problem as well. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq, and I really appreciate Mullah Asim putting this all together, and all the peeps that we can see their videos turned off, but the rest can't see them. Those in the background, those that are there. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward everybody and protect our community and make it easy for us. Allahumma ameen ya Rabbil Alameen.
Ameen, Ya Rabbil Alameen. So once again, just to reiterate, um, the link is on the screen for volunteering. We welcome anybody, whatever skills you have, as long as you're willing to be part of the effort to help the Ummah of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam on this blessed night of not New Year's Eve, but the night of Friday. Inshallah, have a click on the link, send in whatever you want, whatever suggestions you have. We're more than willing to take people on. Inshallah, I once again, this hopefully is the first conversation of many. There's many other topics that we have only touched the surface of. There's many other causal deep issues that we haven't even navigated properly, and those are things that I know both of our guests definitely have a lot of insight to share. And I just want to close off by thanking both Maulana Shams and my teacher friend Maulana Shams for the amazing effort that he makes for us as a community, and also for tonight's insightful conversation, and also Sergeant Raja for his time here for tonight, obviously Mr. Raja. But I thank him again for the incredible contribution, the deep insights that he's had into our community. I mean, and I hope he's done a lot, and I really mean this, I hope he's done a lot to remove a lot of the negative stereotypes people have of Muslim policemen, of just police in general, as some sort of evil force that are coming to just destroy our communities. There are good people within every single institution, and there are bad people within every institution, and we inshallah will take from the good and leave that which is evil. So on that note, inshallah, I finish today, and I pray Allah Jalla wa Ala creates immense blessings for us in the future, and allows us to be a community that protects itself through the sunnah of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik, wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruk wa natubu ilayk. Amen.
Assalamu alaikum.